Already done, Sergeant, she replied, holding up a meticulously organized inventory sheet, including the extra hemostatic gauze from yesterday's drop. Mills paused, momentarily surprised by her efficiency, then grunted what might have been approval before moving on. Becky was used to it. In her 6 months at Outpost Viper, she'd earned a reputation as a skilled medic, perhaps the best the unit had seen, but little else. To the operators, she was simply Doc, or the bandage carrier, just another support element. In the small space she called her own, Becky arranged her medical supplies with practiced precision. Her area stood in stark contrast to the organized chaos of the outpost. Sterile, ordered, everything in its place. A worn photograph was taped to the wall beside her cot. An elderly man in hunting gear, rifle balanced casually in the crook of his arm, standing beside a much younger Becky on what appeared to be a misty mountain ridge. His weathered face bore the same determined expression that occasionally flashed across Becky's features when she thought no one was watching. The rusty fuel barrel outside her tent leaked a familiar petroleum smell that somehow, strangely, felt like home. The isolated outpost, with its peeling paint and jury-rigged equipment, existed in a strange bubble of American military presence, surrounded by a landscape that had witnessed empires rise and fall for thousands of years. "Doc, got a minute?" The voice belonged to Specialist Rodriguez, holding out his arm where a deep gash was poorly covered with a hastily applied bandage. "What happened this time?" Becky asked, already reaching for her kit. "Caught it on some concertina wire during perimeter check," he explained, wincing as she removed the makeshift dressing. As she cleaned and sutured the wound with swift, confident movements, Rodriguez studied her face. "You got steady hands, Doc. Ever handle a weapon with that kind of precision?" Her fingers paused almost imperceptibly before continuing their work. "I know enough to qualify," she said evenly, "but my job is putting soldiers back together, not taking enemies apart." Rodriguez nodded, accepting the deflection. "Fair enough. The way things are heating up around here, might not hurt to brush up on your marksmanship." Becky didn't respond, focusing instead on completing the neat row of stitches. What Rodriguez couldn't see was the momentary distance in her eyes, the muscle memory in her fingers that knew far more than basic qualification with a service weapon. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the Hindu Kush Mountains, casting the valley in deepening purple shadows, Becky sat outside the medical tent, writing in a small leather-bound journal. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a diary or medical notes. In reality, it contained detailed calculations of wind patterns, elevation adjustments, and ballistic trajectories, all meticulously documented from the bullet wounds she'd treated over the past months. In the distance, the mountains of Pakistan loomed like silent sentinels, harboring threats both known and unknown. Tomorrow, Operation Iron Serpent would take them deep into that unforgiving terrain. Becky closed her journal, her thumb brushing over the worn leather corner where her grandfather's initials were embossed. H.M. "Hawk," she whispered to herself. "I hope I never have to break my promise." The smell of pine and early morning mist filled 8-year-old Becky's lungs as she followed her grandfather through the dense Maine forest. Harold Hawk Morgan moved with a silent grace that belied his 65 years, each step placed with deliberate care to avoid creating sound. The year was 1991, and while most girls her age were watching cartoons on Saturday mornings, Becky was learning to become invisible. "Remember, little bird," Harold whispered, using a special nickname for her, "the forest has 1,000 eyes and ears. To move among them, you must become part of them." They reached a small clearing where the morning light filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Harold crouched down, motioning for Becky to do the same. From his backpack, he produced a small pair of binoculars. "Today, we learn to see what others miss." The Morgan family property sprawled across 300 acres of pristine woodland in Ridgway, Maine. The land had been in the family since 1779, when Becky's ancestor, a sharpshooter in the Continental Army, had been granted the tract for his service during the Revolutionary War. What few knew was that marksmanship had been a Morgan family tradition ever since. From the Civil War to World War II, Korea to Vietnam, the Morgan men had served as elite marksmen. Harold himself had been part of the ill-fated Operation Eagle Claw in 1980, the failed attempt to rescue American hostages in Iran. Though publicly recorded as a helicopter pilot, his actual role had been much more specialized. Most people look, but they don't see, Harold explained, adjusting the binoculars for Becky's smaller face. A hunter's eye notices the broken twig, the disturbed earth, the patterns that don't belong. For hours they remained motionless, observing the woodland creatures that emerge when they believe themselves alone. Harold taught her to read the forest, how to distinguish the alarm call of a blue jay from its normal chatter, how to spot the subtle movement of a white-tailed deer through dense underbrush nearly half a mile away. Only when the sun reached its zenith did Harold finally stand, his knees cracking slightly. "Come on, little bird. Time for the next lesson." They hiked deeper into the property until they reached a natural ridge overlooking a distant meadow. Harold unfolded a small shooting mat and placed a weathered leather case on the ground. From it, he removed a bolt-action .22 rifle that had been modified for a smaller frame. "This was my first rifle," he said, running his hand lovingly along the wooden stock. "My father gave it to me when I was 10. I've adjusted it for you." Becky's eyes widened. She'd seen her grandfather's rifles before, locked safely in the cabinet at the farmhouse, but had never been allowed to touch one. "Your father won't approve," she said softly. A shadow crossed Harold's face. His son, Becky's father, had broken with family tradition, choosing a career in engineering instead of military service. The first Morgan man in 7 generations not to answer the call. "Your father has made his choices," Harold replied carefully. "But I see something in you, Rebecca. The same thing my father saw in me, the Morgan eye." By the time she was 12, Becky could hit targets at distances that would impress military marksmen. By 15, she could calculate wind drift and bullet drop with mathematical precision. Harold never explicitly mentioned military service or combat applications, but the skills he imparted went far beyond recreational shooting or hunting. On her 16th birthday, Harold took her to a special place on the property, an old service station that had been in the family since the 1950s, situated just off Route 1. Morgan's fuel stop had once been a bustling business when the highway was the main thoroughfare, but had closed in the 1980s when the interstate diverted traffic elsewhere. "This place isn't what it seems," Harold said, unlocking the padlock on the faded red door. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that penetrated the dirty windows. Old motor oil cans and vintage advertising signs created the perfect image of an abandoned rural gas station. Harold moved to the back office, where a large wooden desk sat covered in yellowed papers. He pulled the desk aside, revealing a trapdoor set into the wooden floorboards. "During the Cold War," he explained as he lifted the heavy door, "men like me needed safe places, off the books." Below was a concrete staircase leading to a fully equipped bunker, communications equipment, weapons racks, maps covering the walls, and filing cabinets filled with documents bearing government seals. "This is a Blood Hawk station," Harold said, his voice taking on a reverence Becky had never heard before. "What's Blood Hawk?" she asked, running her fingers over a faded emblem on one of the maps, a stylized hawk with a drop of red at its beak. "Officially nothing. We don't exist in any record. But since 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis brought us to the brink, we've been there, making sure it never happens again." The September rain pelted the church windows like buckshot, providing a grim soundtrack to the hollow words of the military chaplain. 22-year-old Becky sat in the front pew, her black dress soaked at the hem from the walk across the cemetery grounds. Her mother, Martha Morgan, clutched her hand with white knuckles as they both stared at the flag-draped coffin. Harold Hawk Morgan, officially recorded as a civilian contractor for the Defense Department, had died in what the government tersely described as an incident in the Middle East. No details provided, no context given. Just another unsung casualty in America's endless shadow wars. But Becky knew better. 3 weeks earlier, she'd received a coded message from her grandfather, a simple postcard of the Maine coastline with seemingly innocent tourist notes. To trained eyes, it conveyed his final operation, a hostage extraction in northern Syria, targeting a compound where an American aid worker was being held. The rain intensified as the honor guard folded the flag with ceremonial precision. When the captain presented it to Martha, Becky noticed the man's hands, calloused in patterns that came from handling specialized weapons, not standard military issue. His eyes met hers briefly, a flash of recognition passing between them. Another Bloodhawk, paying respects to one of their own. After the service, mourners gathered at the Morgan farmhouse. Becky moved mechanically through the rituals of grief, accepting condolences from distant relatives and local townspeople who knew Harold as a respected veteran and business owner. Nothing more. As the crowd thinned, a tall man in his 50s approached. His military bearing was evident despite the civilian clothes, his handshake firm as he introduced himself to Martha. "James Harrington, ma'am. I served with your father-in-law in Desert Storm. His leadership saved my life more than once." When he turned to Becky, his expression shifted subtly. "You have his eyes," he said quietly. Later, when most guests had departed, Harrington found Becky alone on the porch, staring out at the rain-soaked fields. "He spoke of you often," Harrington said, leaning against the railing beside her. "His little bird with the Morgan eye." Becky didn't look at him. "Were you there when it happened?" Harrington's silence was answer enough. Finally, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small brass object, a single rifle cartridge, a .338 Lapua Magnum, with words microscopically etched along its length. "He wanted you to have this, said you'd understand what to do with it." Becky took the cartridge, rolling it between her fingers until she could make out the inscription, "Shoot in the space between heartbeats." "What really happened?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the rain. Harrington looked out toward the darkening tree line. "The official report will say he died protecting the extraction team when the primary plan failed. That's true, as far as it goes." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What it won't say is that he identified the ambush before anyone else, recognized a pattern in the enemy's deployment that no one should have been able to see. He got the hostage and 3 team members out before the building collapsed." "And the enemy shooters?" "7 confirmed, at ranges exceeding what should have been possible given the conditions. Your grandfather's final mission was extraordinary." Tears welled in Becky's eyes, not just from grief, but from pride. In his final moments, Harold Morgan had embodied everything he'd taught her. "He made me promise him something," she said after a long silence. "Last Christmas, when I told him I was considering military service, he made me swear I would use what he taught me only to protect, never to harm, that I would find a way to save lives, not take them." Harrington nodded slowly. "That sounds like Hawk in his later years. After decades in the shadows, he came to believe the best service was preservation, not elimination." He straightened up, adjusting his coat against the chill. "Whatever path you choose, Rebecca, know that there are others who will recognize what he saw in you. When the time comes, we'll be there." That night, she drove alone to Morgan's fuel stop. The old service station stood silhouetted against the cloudy night sky, a relic of a bygone era. Using the key Harold had given her on her 16th birthday, she entered the musty interior and made her way to the trapdoor. The bunker was exactly as they'd left it during their last training session. Maps still marked with operation zones, filing cabinets still organized in Harold's meticulous system. On the central table lay a sealed envelope with her name written in his steady hand. Inside was a letter and a small key. "My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, then I've made my final shot. Don't grieve too long. Every Morgan since the Revolution has understood that our gift comes with a price. You've wondered why I trained you so intensively when you expressed no desire for military service. The truth is, I recognized in you something rare. Not just the Morgan eye, but a Morgan heart. You see the target, yes, but you also see the person. This combination is precious and dangerous. Bloodhawk was created with noble intentions, to prevent global catastrophe through precisely applied force. For decades, we operated with moral clarity, but institutions age and intentions blur. In recent years, I've seen troubling signs that our original mission has been compromised. The enclosed key opens the floor safe beneath the weapons rack. Inside, you'll find evidence I've gathered and my personal records. What you do with them must be your choice. Remember what I taught you. The rifle doesn't make the shooter. The eye doesn't make the hunter. It's the heart that decides whether our gift serves life or death. Whatever path you choose, know that I am prouder of you than words can express. You are the finest Morgan I've ever trained, and the best person I've had the privilege to know. Shoot in the space between heartbeats, little bird." Hawk tears streamed down Becky's face as she retrieved the key and moved to the weapons rack. Pushing it aside revealed a small floor safe which opened with a soft click. Inside was a weathered journal, several microfilm canisters, and a USB drive secured in a waterproof case. She spent the entire night reading her grandfather's journal, absorbing his growing concerns about Blood Hawk operations, his documentation of missions that seemed to serve political or corporate interests rather than genuine security threats. The final entries detailed his investigation into an emerging mercenary group called Crimson Crown, former special operators from both NATO and Warsaw Pact countries, operating with tactics suspiciously similar to Blood Hawk protocols. By dawn, Becky had made her decision. She would honor both her promise and her grandfather's legacy, but in her own way. She enrolled in medical school the following week, focusing on emergency and combat medicine. The Morgan eye would be used to save lives on the battlefield, not to take them. The brass cartridge became her talisman, worn on a thin chain around her neck, hidden beneath her clothes, a constant reminder of her vow and her heritage. Colonel James Harrington stood at the edge of Outpost Viper's makeshift helipad, squinting against the swirling dust kicked up by the departing Blackhawk. At 60, his once black hair had surrendered to silver, but his posture remained ramrod straight, his gaze still falcon sharp. 28 years in special operations had carved permanent lines around his eyes and mouth, creating a face that revealed nothing while observing everything. As the helicopter disappeared over the ridgeline, he turned back toward the command center, a reinforced shipping container outfitted with communications equipment and battle maps. Operation Iron Serpent would commence at Yo 500 tomorrow, sending his best operators into one of the most contested valleys in Kunar province. Intelligence suggested a high-value Taliban commander was using a remote village as a base of operations, possibly holding an American aid worker captured 3 weeks earlier. Inside the command center, Harrington reviewed the operational plans one final time. The mission parameters were straightforward: infiltrate the village, confirm the HVT's presence, extract the hostage if present, eliminate resistance only if necessary. Standard counterinsurgency doctrine emphasized minimal civilian casualties, a policy Harrington supported in principle, but found increasingly difficult to implement in practice. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, not looking up from the topographical map spread across the table. "Sir, medical inventory for the mission," came a female voice. Harrington glanced up to see the combat medic, Specialist Rebecca Morgan, holding a clipboard. For a moment, he kept his expression neutral, though his mind immediately made the connection he'd been anticipating since her assignment to Outpost Viper 3 months ago. "Morgan," he said evenly, "how are the men looking? Any concerns before tomorrow?" "All operational elements are medically cleared, sir," she replied professionally. "I've prepared additional trauma kits based on the terrain assessment. The valley's narrow passages will complicate case evac if we take casualties." Harrington nodded, studying her face. The resemblance to Harold was subtle but unmistakable. Not in her features, which favored her mother's side, but in the quality of attention behind her eyes. The Morgan eye, Harold had called it, an almost preternatural ability to observe and process visual information. "You've gone beyond standard prep," he noted, gesturing to her clipboard. "Those calculations aren't in the standard medical manual." Becky hesitated almost imperceptibly. "I've been tracking injury patterns, sir. There's a statistical correlation between elevation changes and the types of trauma we're seeing. I thought it might help prioritize equipment. Mind if I see?" She handed him the clipboard. What appeared at first glance to be medical notes revealed itself, to experienced eyes, as something far more sophisticated. Becky had mapped wound patterns across previous missions, correlating them with terrain features, time of day, and weather conditions. To most officers, it would seem like thorough medical analysis. To Harrington, it was unmistakably an intelligence product, the kind of pattern recognition that distinguished elite snipers and counter-snipers. "Impressive work, Specialist," he said, returning the clipboard. "You have a unique perspective." "Thank you, sir. Just trying to keep our people alive." Harrington gestured to a chair. "Sit for a moment. Coffee?" "No, thank you, sir." He poured himself a cup from the ancient coffee maker in the corner, giving himself a moment to consider his approach. "Morgan, he began, seating himself across from her. "I knew your grandfather." Her expression remained carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. You attended his funeral." "Before that," Harrington continued, "we served together. first in Desert Storm officially, and in other capacities. He watched her reaction closely, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the fractional narrowing of her eyes, controlled but detectable to someone who knew what to look for. He was an extraordinary man, Harrington said, one of the finest operators I ever knew. Thank you, sir. Harrington leaned forward slightly. Your analysis here, he tapped the clipboard. It reminds me of his work. He had a way of seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. Becky remained silent, her posture perfect, betraying nothing. I've reviewed your file, Morgan. West Point offered you admission. Your marksmanship qualifications are suspiciously perfect for someone with minimal firearms experience. Yet you chose medical training and enlisted rather than pursuing a commission. I wanted to save lives, sir, not command others to take them. Harrington nodded slowly. A noble calling, your grandfather would approve. He paused, then asked, do you still have the cartridge? The question hung in the air between them. After a long moment, Becky reached beneath her collar and withdrew the brass .338 Lapua round on its chain. He said you'd understand what to do with it, Harrington said softly. I do, Joe. I'm doing it now. Harrington studied her, respect evident in his gaze. Your grandfather and I were part of something, Morgan. Something that began with the noblest intentions but, like many long-standing institutions, developed complications. Bloodhawk, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. So he told you. Enough. Harrington rose and moved to a small safe concealed behind a map of the province. From it, he retrieved a worn leather case, similar to a passport wallet but thicker. He placed it on the table between them. Harold Morgan was more than my colleague. He was my closest friend for 30 years. We joined Bloodhawk together in 1975, served through some of the darkest chapters of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union fell, we thought our work would become simpler. Instead, it became more complex. He opened the case, revealing a small pin with the Bloodhawk emblem, a stylized hawk with a drop of red at its beak. In the early days, our mission was clear. Prevent nuclear war, protect critical infrastructure, eliminate existential threats before they materialize. We operated beyond politics, beyond national interests, focused solely on preventing global catastrophe. His weathered fingers traced the emblem. By the 90s, things had changed. New leadership, new priorities. Bloodhawk began taking assignments that served particular political or economic interests. Harold objected, questioned orders, eventually became something of an internal dissident. That's why he was in Syria, Becky said, the pieces finally connecting. He wasn't just extracting a hostage. Harrington nodded gravely. He was pursuing evidence against elements within Bloodhawk that had gone rogue, specifically connections to a mercenary group called Crimson Crown. I've read his journals. Then you know he suspected certain Bloodhawk operations had been compromised, utilized for objectives contrary to our founding principles. Becky's eyes narrowed. Were you part of that, sir? The directness of the question seemed to age Harrington instantly. No, but I failed him by not supporting his investigation more actively. Caution and career preservation, he admitted with evident shame. By the time I understood the depth of his concerns, it was too late. Who was with him? When he died? Harrington's face darkened. That's where things get complicated. The team leader was Raymond Keller, one of the best tactical commanders Bloodhawk ever produced. But Harold had confided to me that he suspected Keller might be connected to Crimson Crown. Becky leaned forward, her professional composure momentarily forgotten. My grandfather was sent on a mission led by someone he suspected of betrayal. Harold insisted on going. He believed he could gather final proof of Keller's involvement, but the operation went sideways almost immediately. Ambush was waiting, too precise, too prepared. And Keller? Officially killed in action. Body never recovered. Harrington's tone suggested he had doubts about this conclusion. Before she could press further, the communications officer burst through the door. Colonel, urgent intel update from Bagram. Satellite imagery shows unusual movement in the target village. Heat signatures consistent with additional fighters arriving within the last hour. Harrington was instantly on his feet. Get the team leaders. Brief room in 5. As the officer rushed out, Harrington turned back to Becky. We'll continue this discussion when you return from the mission. For now, focus on your medical duties. But keep your eyes open, Morgan. You see things others don't. Becky rose, tucking the cartridge back beneath her uniform. Always do, sir. The medical tent at Outpost Viper hummed with the quiet efficiency that Becky had established during her tenure. Wounded soldiers came in, stabilized soldiers went out. Each case meticulously documented, each treatment adapted to the harsh realities of combat medicine in remote mountains. Yet beneath this orderly surface ran an undercurrent that few would notice, a pattern emerging from chaos. 2 weeks before Operation Iron Serpent, Becky had begun noticing anomalies in the wounds she treated. The entry profiles of certain gunshot injuries didn't match the typical Taliban weaponry. The tissue damage suggested higher velocities, the entry wounds unnervingly precise. Late at night, after her shift ended, she'd extract bullet fragments during debridement procedures, carefully setting aside particular pieces for later examination. In her private journal, disguised as medical notes, she documented each anomaly, each fragment, building a mosaic that only someone with her specialized training would recognize. On this particular evening, Staff Sergeant Willis was her patient, a burly Special Forces operator with a through-and-through wound to his left thigh. "Lucky shot," he grunted as Becky irrigated the wound. "Bastard must have been having a good day." "Or you were having a bad one," she replied with the easy camaraderie she'd developed with the operators. "Entry wound is unusually clean. Sniper?" Willis nodded, wincing as she probed gently. "Yeah, we were clearing a compound about 2 clicks south of tomorrow's insertion point. No warning. Martinez spotted a glint from the ridgeline about 800 meters out. Then bam, I'm on the ground. Single shot? Yeah, followed by nothing. Didn't even try for a second target. Just one and done." Becky's hands remained steady, but her mind accelerated. One shot, exceptional accuracy, no follow-up despite a clear opportunity. Not typical Taliban tactics, which usually favored volume of fire over precision. "Mind if I dig a little deeper?" she asked. "I think there might be a fragment still in there." Willis shrugged. "Knock yourself out, Doc. Not like I'm going anywhere." Using a pair of fine forceps, Becky extracted a tiny metal shard from the wound channel, too small to cause additional damage, but large enough to confirm her suspicions. She dropped it into a specimen container, labeled it, and continued treatment. Later, alone in her quarters, she examined the fragment under a portable microscope she'd requisitioned for parasite identification. What she saw confirmed her growing theory. The metal composition wasn't standard NATO or Russian manufacture. It had a distinctive alloy signature she recognized from her grandfather's records. A specialized bullet designed for extreme long-range accuracy, manufactured in limited quantities by a Czech arms firm with historical ties to Soviet special programs. In her journal, she added this latest data point to her growing collection. Pinned to the inside cover was a hand-drawn map of the region, with small red dots indicating where each anomalous wound had occurred. To the casual observer, the dots might seem random. To Becky's trained eye, they formed a pattern, a deliberate series of shooting positions that created a net around Outpost Viper and its operational areas. Someone was mapping their movements, establishing firing solutions, preparing for something bigger. A soft knock at her door startled her. She quickly closed the journal and slid it under her pillow before calling, "Come in." Lieutenant Wilson stepped inside, his face grim. "Wanted to check if you're squared away for tomorrow." "All set, sir. Just finalizing some notes on our recent casualties." Wilson's eyes drifted to the microscope on her desk, then to the specimen container beside it. "That from Willis?" "Yes, sir. Unusual fragmentation pattern. I was curious." Wilson picked up the container, studying the metal shard inside. "Doesn't look like standard Taliban issue." "No, sir. The composition and ballistic characteristics suggest something specialized." Wilson set the container down and fixed her with a penetrating stare. "You know, Morgan, I've been watching you. Most medics patch wounds and move on. You analyze them like they're telling you a story. Every wound has a narrative, sir. Direction, velocity, tissue damage. They all provide information about the weapon system and the shooter." "That's not standard medical training talk," Wilson observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Sounds more like something you'd hear from a ballistics expert or a sniper." Becky's heart rate increased, but her expression remained calm. "My father was an engineer. I grew up around technical discussions of materials and mechanics. Your father, Wilson repeated slowly. Not your grandfather? The decorated veteran? A warning flared in Becky's mind. Wilson had been digging into her background. Both influenced me in different ways, she said evenly. Wilson leaned against the doorframe, his posture deliberately casual. Interesting thing about military records. Sometimes what's not there tells you more than what is. Your grandfather's service history has some convenient gaps. Many veterans of his generation don't discuss everything they did, sir. True enough. Wilson nodded, then abruptly changed tack. We're running a live fire exercise in 20 minutes. Last chance to check equipment and zero weapons before tomorrow's op. Thought you might want to observe, given your interest in ballistic patterns. It wasn't really an invitation, it was a test. I'd be happy to, sir. Let me just secure my medical supplies. Meet us at the range in 15. Wilson turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Morgan? Bring your sidearm. Everyone's qualifying tonight, support personnel included. Colonel's orders. After Wilson left, Becky sat motionless, analyzing the exchange. Wilson was suspicious. How much he knew remained unclear, but he was deliberately creating a situation to test her. The standard qualification for medical personnel was basic marksmanship, nothing that would raise eyebrows. But if she performed too well, she reached beneath her cot and removed a small metal case. Inside was a set of tools for adjusting weapon sights, not standard issue for a medic. For 5 years, she had been careful to maintain a profile of adequate but unremarkable marksmanship during qualifications. Tonight, she would need to continue that deception, despite every instinct screaming against deliberately missing targets. At the range, operators were already cycling through various weapon stations, checking zeros on M4s, confirming optics on designated marksman rifles, test firing the heavier .50 caliber for anti-material applications. Wilson stood near the pistol qualification lane, watching her approach. Morgan, good, you're up after Davis. She nodded, checking her regulation M9 Beretta with practiced movements that she consciously kept slightly awkward. Around her, Delta operators handled their weapons with the fluid confidence that comes from thousands of hours of training. She needed to appear competent, but distinctly different from them. Davis finished his qualification, hitting center mass on all but one target. Wilson recorded the score, then gestured Becky forward. Standard qual course Morgan, 15 rounds, 5 targets, varying distances. You know the drill. Becky took her position, aware that several operators had paused their own activities to watch. She adopted the standard firing stance taught in basic training, serviceable but lacking the refined balance that Harold had drilled into her since childhood. Whenever you're ready, specialist, Wilson called. Becky raised the pistol, aligned the sights, and began firing. Her first shots were deliberately placed just off center mass, good enough to qualify, but nothing remarkable. As she progressed through the course, she maintained this careful mediocrity, fighting against muscle memory that wanted to place each round exactly where it belonged. Then, as she fired at the furthest target, a sudden explosion rocked the outpost, a mortar round impacting near the perimeter. Training instantly took over. Without conscious thought, Becky shifted to a perfect shooter's stance, fired 3 rapid rounds that formed a tight group directly center mass, then dropped to a crouch, scanning for threats. The entire range had erupted into activity, operators moving with practiced efficiency toward defensive positions. Wilson, however, remained still, his eyes locked on Becky's target, and the 3 perfect shots that no average medic should have been capable of making under stress. Their eyes met across the range, and in that moment, Becky knew her careful facade had cracked. Wilson's expression wasn't accusatory, but evaluating, as if confirming a theory he'd already developed. All personnel, stand down, came the announcement over the PA system. Perimeter reports single mortar round, no follow-up. Return to normal operations. As the tension eased, Wilson approached Becky, who had holstered her weapon and was preparing to return to her duties. Interesting response to the explosion, Morgan, he said quietly. Most people flinch when unexpected booms happen. You got more accurate. Adrenaline affects people differently, sir. That it does. Wilson glanced down at her hands, which were completely steady despite the recent stress. Those 3 shots, that's not basic qualification shooting. That's expert-level marksmanship under duress. Lucky grouping, sir. No such thing as luck with shooting like that. Wilson's voice remained low, ensuring their conversation stayed private. I've only seen that kind of instinctive response in people with very specific training backgrounds, the kind that becomes so ingrained it overrides conscious control in crisis situations. Becky met his gaze directly. What are you suggesting, sir? Nothing yet. Just noting that there's more to our combat medic than meets the eye. He handed her the target sheet with her qualification scores. For the record, you passed with the minimum required score. The last 3 shots never happened. The implicit message was clear. Wilson knew she had deliberately underperformed, then slipped when instinct took over. But instead of exposing her, he was offering a tacit agreement to maintain her cover, for now. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Morgan. Tomorrow we're heading into territory where your shooting was reportedly done by professionals who don't miss. If those skills of yours become necessary, I expect you won't hesitate to use them, regardless of what's on your official record. With that, Wilson walked away, leaving Becky with the unsettling realization that her carefully constructed identity was beginning to unravel, just as they prepared to enter what might be a sophisticated ambush. The pre-dawn darkness shrouded Outpost Viper in an uneasy quiet. Becky sat on her cot, the small LED flashlight clenched between her teeth as she made final adjustments to her medical pack. Each item was checked twice, positioned for maximum accessibility. Lives would depend on her ability to reach the right equipment in seconds. But it wasn't just medical gear occupying her thoughts. Last night's incident at the range had confirmed what she'd feared. Lieutenant Wilson had seen through her carefully maintained facade. The question now was what he intended to do with that knowledge. A soft tap at her tent flap interrupted her thoughts. She quickly covered the specialized tools she'd been hiding among her medical supplies. A rangefinder disguised as a medical device, ballistic calculation cards concealed within procedural manuals. "Come in," she called softly. Sergeant Martinez entered, his muscular frame filling the entrance. At 34, he was one of the most experienced operators in the unit, with 4 combat tours before this deployment. "Doc," he nodded. "Got a minute?" "Of course. Everything okay for the mission?" Martinez glanced over his shoulder, then stepped fully inside, letting the tent flap close behind him. "That's what I wanted to ask you. Word is you and Wilson had an interesting qualification session last night." Becky kept her expression neutral. "Standard procedure before a mission." "Nothing standard about hitting a perfect triangle at 25 meters during a mortar attack," Martinez said, his voice low. "Not for a regular medic, anyway." So it had spread already. The special operations community was small, and gossip traveled faster than official communications. "What do you want, Sergeant?" Becky asked directly. Martinez studied her face, then reached into his pocket. "I want you to have this." He handed her a small object, a challenge coin, its metal worn smooth from years of being carried. One side bore the insignia of his original unit. The other had been crudely but effectively etched with a medical caduceus. "Made it myself," Martinez explained. "After what you did for me 2 months ago, pulling that shrapnel from my abdomen when everyone else thought I was done for, figured you should have something to remember us by." The gesture caught Becky off guard. Challenge coins were part of military tradition, symbols of belonging and recognition, typically exchanged between members of the same unit. For Martinez to give her one represented a rare acknowledgement from the operator community. "Thank you," she said, genuinely moved. "I'll keep it with me." Martinez nodded, then added in an even lower voice, "Look, Doc, I don't know what your story is, and I don't need to, but I've been in this game long enough to recognize when someone's playing a role. Whatever you're hiding, it saved my life once already." He moved toward the exit, then turned back. "Wilson knows too. He's not going to report anything, but he'll be watching you out there today. And just so you know," Martinez paused, his expression deadly serious, "something doesn't feel right about this mission. Too many intel gaps, too many last-minute changes. Keep your head on a swivel." After he left, Becky sat motionless, absorbing the implications. Martinez had essentially confirmed that her cover was compromised among at least some of the operators. Yet instead of suspicion, she was being met with a cautious acceptance and a warning. She slipped Martinez's coin into her pocket alongside her grandfather's cartridge. 2 talismans representing the dual nature of her service and the growing impossibility of keeping those worlds separate. Outside, the first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky. The rumble of helicopter engines signaled the imminent departure of Operation Iron Serpent. Becky completed her preparations, securing her medical pack and checking her sidearm, no longer pretending awkwardness in her handling of the weapon. As she emerged from her tent, she spotted Wilson conferring with his team near the helipad. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Whatever happened today, pretenses were thinning. At the final briefing, Colonel Harrington reviewed the mission parameters one last time. The intelligence suggested a high-value Taliban commander was using a remote village as a base, possibly holding an American aid worker hostage. 2 helicopters would insert the teams at separate locations near the target. Alpha team, led by Wilson, would approach from the south. Bravo team would establish a blocking position to the north. Becky would accompany Alpha team, positioned to provide immediate medical support. One final note, Harrington concluded, his gaze sweeping the assembled operators. Latest intelligence indicates unusual activity in the target area. Possibility of specialized opposition beyond standard Taliban fighters. Maintain heightened awareness. It was as close as he could come to warning them about Crimson Crown without revealing classified information. Becky caught his momentary glance in her direction, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding. As the teams moved toward the helicopters, Becky felt a presence beside her. Wilson had fallen into step with her, his voice pitched just for her ears. Those skills you're hiding, Doc, they officially don't exist. But if things go sideways out there today, and you see something the rest of us don't hesitate. Clear? She met his gaze steadily. Clear, sir. The helicopters lifted off as the first rays of sunlight painted the mountaintops in brilliant gold. Below, the rugged landscape of Kunar province unfolded, a terrain that had broken the ambitions of empires for centuries. The flight would be brief, less than 15 minutes to the insertion point. Seated next to the door, Becky used these final moments to center herself. Her eyes closed, she focused on her breathing, a technique Harold had taught her for steadying both mind and body. In, hold, out, hold, finding the natural pause between heartbeats when perfect stillness exists. When she opened her eyes, she found Wilson watching her with quiet assessment. Controlled breathing, as she explained over the headset, helps manage stress hormones. He nodded. Snipers use the same technique. The comment hung between them, an acknowledgement rather than an accusation. As the helicopter began its descent toward a small clearing 2 kilometers from the target village, Becky performed a final equipment check. Her primary role remained clear. Combat medic, responsible for the health and survival of the operators. But beneath that identity lay the inheritance of generations of Morgans, trained to see what others missed and act when necessary. The coin in her pocket reminded her of her duty to these men who had come to trust her. The cartridge reminded her of a deeper legacy and a promise that now seemed increasingly difficult to keep. The helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and vegetation. Delta operators deployed with practiced efficiency, establishing a security perimeter within seconds. Becky followed, medical pack secure on her back, moving with a quiet competence that had earned her reluctant respect. As they began their movement toward the target, she scanned the surrounding ridgelines with an attention that went beyond medical concern. The Morgan eye, assessing sight lines, calculating distances, identifying potential firing positions. Knowledge she had sworn to use only for protection, never for harm. 2 hours into their approach, Alpha Team reached a rocky outcropping overlooking the target village. Wilson signaled for a halt, deploying his men in a defensive position while he surveyed the settlement through high-powered binoculars. Doc, Wilson called softly, waving her over. Take a look. He handed her the binoculars, pointing toward the village. Central building with the metal roof. Notice anything? Becky adjusted the focus, scanning the structure. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Just another mud brick building with a corrugated metal roof, common in these mountain communities. Then she saw it, a slight discoloration on the roofline, a pattern of wear inconsistent with normal weather exposure. Observation post, she said without hesitation. Roof's been accessed regularly. See the wear pattern on the eastern edge? Someone's been lying there watching. Wilson nodded. Exactly. And those footpaths leading to the north ridge? Too uniform for goat herders. Professional movement patterns, Becky agreed. Disciplined, consistent use of the same routes. You've got quite an eye for someone with medical training, Wilson remarked, his tone making it clear he knew exactly why she could spot these details. Before she could respond, Martinez crawled up beside them. Boss, found something you need to see. He led them to a position 30 meters east, where a shallow depression in the rocky soil revealed what appeared to be a freshly discarded wrapper, a distinctive dark green packaging with Cyrillic lettering. Russian MRE, Martinez identified, not Taliban standard issue. Becky picked it up carefully, examining the lot number printed on the back. This is recent production. Special Forces quality, not regular Army. How the hell do you know that? Martinez asked, then immediately waved off his own question. Never mind, don't want to know. Wilson studied the packaging, then looked at Becky. What else can you tell me about this area? What are you seeing that we're not? The question was a turning point, a direct invitation to utilize her hidden expertise. Becky hesitated only briefly before deciding that protecting these men outweighed maintaining her cover. The village layout is defensive, buildings arranged to funnel approaching forces into predetermined kill zones. Those irrigation ditches aren't just for agriculture. They're positioned to provide covered movement for defenders. She pointed to the northern ridge. 3 primary sniper positions, based on optimal fields of fire. If I were setting up an ambush, that's where I'd place my best shooters. Wilson absorbed this assessment without surprise. Recommendations? Change our approach. Come in from the east, using that dry riverbed for cover. It's the one angle they've left relatively undefended, probably because the terrain is difficult. And if we encounter specialized opposition? The question's subtext was clear. Wilson was asking if she was prepared to use her true skills if necessary. I'll do whatever is required to ensure the team's survival, sir. Wilson held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Martinez, radio the colonel. Tell him we're adjusting our approach due to signs of professional opposition. Request Bravo team reposition to cover the northern ridge. As Martinez moved away to make the call, Wilson turned back to Becky. If this goes sideways, Morgan, I need to know you're all in. No more pretending. I made a promise to my grandfather to use my skills to save lives, not take them, she replied quietly. But sometimes saving lives means removing the threat. Wilson seemed satisfied with this answer. Stay close. If your medical skills are needed, that's priority. But if those other skills become necessary, he left the statement unfinished. Martinez returned, his expression grim. Comms are being jammed. Can't reach the colonel or Bravo team. Wilson's face hardened. That settles it. We're not dealing with standard Taliban. Professional electronic warfare capability means we're walking into something much bigger. He gathered the team for a quick briefing, explaining the change in approach without revealing the full extent of their concerns. As the operators prepared to move out, Becky felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The jamming of communications was a sophisticated tactic, consistent with what she knew of Crimson Crown's capabilities. Under her breath, she murmured the words etched on her grandfather's cartridge. Shoot in the space between heartbeats. Today, that space might be the difference between life and death for everyone in Alpha Team. As they began their cautious advance through the dry riverbed, the sun climbed higher in the Afghan sky. The village lay less than a kilometer ahead, deceptively peaceful in the morning light. But Becky's trained eyes saw what others might miss. The too-perfect stillness, the absence of normal activity, the strategic positioning of seemingly innocent agricultural implements that could provide cover for defenders. Her hand unconsciously drifted to the pocket containing her grandfather's cartridge and Martinez's coin. 2 symbols of the conflicting duties now converging as they moved deeper into what she increasingly believed was a carefully prepared trap. The first shot, when it came, was a whisper rather than a crack, the signature of a suppressed high-caliber rifle. One of the point men dropped instantly, a precision shot to the upper chest just above his body armor. Sniper! Wilson hissed as the team scrambled for cover. Northern Ridge, professional grade. Becky was already moving, medical instincts taking precedence as she low-crawled to the fallen operator. Blood was spreading rapidly across his chest. The round had found the gap between protective plates. I need to get to him now, she called to Wilson. Too exposed, he responded. We need to neutralize that shooter first. Another shot struck inches from Becky's position, sending fragments of rock spraying across her face. This wasn't random fire. The sniper was deliberately targeting her, recognizing the medic as a priority. In that moment, as she watched the wounded operator's life literally bleeding away while pinned down by precise enemy fire, Becky Morgan faced the choice she had been avoiding for 5 years. The fallen operator's rifle lay beside him, an M110 semi-automatic sniper system, already equipped with an advanced optic. Her gaze locked on it, muscle memory stirring, her grandfather's voice echoing in her mind. Sometimes the greatest protection comes from eliminating the threat. Wilson, seeing her hesitation, shouted over the increasing gunfire, "Morgan, we need those skills now or we're all dead." Time seemed to slow as Becky made her decision. With a silent apology to her grandfather, she reached for the rifle. The M110's weight felt both foreign and familiar in Becky's hands, a sensation like returning to a childhood home, everything simultaneously strange and perfectly known. 5 years of deliberately avoiding this moment collapsed in an instant of pure necessity. "Cover me," Wilson shouted to the rest of the team as they laid down suppressive fire toward the northern ridge. Becky moved with fluid precision to a position behind a large boulder, the rifle already tucked against her shoulder. Her breathing slowed automatically. In, hold, out, hold, finding that perfect stillness between heartbeats that her grandfather had drilled into her since childhood. Through the scope, the harsh Afghan landscape transformed into a mathematical grid. Distances, elevations, angles all calculated unconsciously by the Morgan eye. The wind rippled through the scrub brush on the hillside, telling her everything she needed to know about direction and speed. "There," she whispered to herself, spotting the faintest disturbance of light and shadow in a rocky outcropping 847 meters away. No ordinary soldier would have noticed it, but to Becky, the sniper's position might as well have been illuminated with floodlights. She made minute adjustments for elevation and wind, her fingers settling on the trigger with the practiced ease of someone returning to their true nature. In the space between heartbeats, she squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Through the scope, she watched the enemy sniper jerk backward, his position suddenly vacant. One shot, one elimination. But her instincts screamed that this wasn't over. These weren't Taliban fighters, this was Crimson Crown. They would operate in coordinated teams. "Second shooter," she called out, already swinging the rifle to a new position on the ridge. Eastern outcropping, behind the dead tree. Wilson didn't question how she knew. "Everyone stayed down." Becky found the second sniper just as he was repositioning, clearly alarmed by the loss of his teammate. The distance was greater, 923 meters, but the Morgan eye made the necessary calculations instantly. Her second shot cracked across the valley. "Confirm that one's down," and Martinez called, watching through binoculars. Becky was already searching for the third shooter. Crimson Crown would use triangulated positions, standard Bloodhawk protocol. She mentally mapped the terrain, identifying the optimal location for the final member of the sniper team. "There's a third," she stated with calm certainty. "Western approach, using that rock formation for cover. He'll be moving to a secondary position now." Wilson stared at her, a mixture of awe and wariness in his expression. "How can you possibly know that?" "Because it's what I would do," she replied simply, continuing to scan through the scope. The movement was almost imperceptible. A slight shift of shadow behind a cluster of rocks 1,100 meters away. An impossible shot for most marksmen, especially in these conditions. But Becky Morgan wasn't most marksmen. She adjusted her position slightly, factoring in the increased distance and the subtle change in wind patterns at that elevation. This time, when she fired, the round struck a metal fragment on the rock face first, deflecting at precisely the calculated angle to reach the concealed shooter. "Jesus Christ," Martinez breathed, watching through his binoculars as the third sniper collapsed. "That was a bank shot. You deliberately ricocheted that round." "Holy hell, Doc." Wilson's voice held equal parts awe and suspicion. "I've seen Olympic gold medalists who couldn't make that shot." Becky lowered the rifle, the momentary clarity of action fading as the implications of what she'd just done settled over her. 5 years of maintaining her promise, broken in the span of 30 seconds. But there was no time to dwell on moral reckonings. The wounded operator still needed immediate attention. I need to get to Ramirez now, she said, already transitioning back to her role as medic, slinging the rifle across her back. Wilson nodded, dispatching 2 men to provide cover as Becky rushed to the fallen soldier. Her hands moved with the same precision they had shown on the rifle, now applying pressure to the wound, administering a clotting agent, establishing an IV line with practiced efficiency. Pneumothorax, she diagnosed, reaching for her chest decompression kit. The round fragmented on impact. He's got shrapnel dangerously close to his subclavian artery. Martinez knelt beside her, serving as an extra set of hands. Never seen anyone go from sniper to surgeon that fast, he remarked quietly, holding pressure where she directed. Who are you really, Doc? Right now, I'm the person trying to save this man's life, she replied, focused entirely on the intricate procedure. The rest can wait. As she worked, Wilson organized the remaining team members to secure their position. The efficiency of the Delta operators was evident. Despite the shock of what they'd witnessed, they maintained tactical discipline, establishing a defensive perimeter with overlapping fields of fire. Once Ramirez was stabilized, Wilson returned to Becky's side. That kind of shooting isn't taught in any medical school I've ever heard of, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. 3 targets, 3 shots, including a ricochet that shouldn't be possible. That's beyond Special Forces training. Becky met his gaze directly. You're right, it's not standard military training. And then what is it? Before she could answer, a sound from further up the valley caught their attention, the unmistakable thump of helicopter rotors approaching. Could be our extraction, Martinez suggested, already raising his binoculars to scan the horizon. Wilson shook his head. Too soon. QRF wouldn't reach us for at least another 30 minutes. He turned to Becky. Any insights, Doc? Since you seem to know more than you've been letting on. The accusation was clear, but there was no hostility in his tone, just the pragmatic assessment of a team leader trying to keep his people alive. Becky listened intently to the approaching aircraft, her head slightly tilted. My 17s, she identified with certainty. 2 of them, based on the rotor signature, not ours. Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. Sound identification too? You're just full of surprises. We need to move, she urged, already preparing Ramirez for transport. Those aren't random patrols. They're responding specifically to the loss of their sniper team. How would they know already? Martinez questioned. Because they were waiting for us, Becky replied grimly. This whole operation was compromised from the start. Wilson studied her face for a moment, then made a decision. Jenkins, Rodriguez, you're on Ramirez. Everyone else, prepare to move out. We're heading east through the ravine system. As the team prepared to move, Wilson pulled Becky aside. When we get back to base, assuming we do, you and I are having a very long conversation about who you really are and what you're doing on my team. Fair enough, she agreed, but right now I'm the best chance your men have of getting out of here alive. Prove it, Wilson challenged. You've shown you can shoot. Now show me you can lead. And the statement represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. Wilson wasn't just acknowledging her hidden skills. He was testing her capacity to transition from support personnel to tactical asset. The helicopters will deploy blocking forces at the main exit points from this valley, Becky analyzed rapidly. They'll expect us to use the northern passage since it's the most direct route back toward friendly territory. We should instead move southeast through this ravine system. She indicated a narrow passage barely visible among the rocky terrain. It's more difficult terrain, but it offers consistent cover and emerges 3 kilometers east, well outside their likely containment perimeter. Wilson nodded, accepting her assessment. Martinez, take point with Morgan. I'll coordinate our wounded. Move out. As the team began their dangerous journey through the narrow ravine, Becky found herself alongside Martinez, both scanning for threats with practiced vigilance. So, Martinez said quietly as they navigated a particularly treacherous section, you gonna tell me where a medic learns to shoot like that? Family tradition, she replied simply. My grandfather started teaching me when I was 8. Martinez processed this without obvious reaction. Must have been one hell of a grandfather. He was, Becky agreed, a note of pride entering her voice despite the circumstances. He believed in being prepared for anything. Well, I owe him a debt, Martinez said, gesturing toward his abdomen where Becky had treated a severe wound 2 months earlier. First, you saved my life with those magic hands of yours. Now you're getting us all out of an ambush with shooting skills I've never seen outside of Olympic competitions. The compliment carried genuine appreciation, suggesting that at least some of the operators were accepting her expanded role without resentment or suspicion. Their conversation was interrupted by a radio transmission from Wilson. Movement at R6, two teams descending from the northern ridge. They've picked up our trail. The pursuit had begun sooner than anticipated. Becky's mind rapidly calculated options, the Morgan eye transforming the surrounding terrain into a tactical grid of opportunities and constraints. There's a fork in the ravine system approximately 200 meters ahead, she informed Martinez. The southern branch appears to dead end, but actually connects to a cave system that emerges near that distinctive rock formation to the east. Martinez studied her with newfound respect. You've been here before? No, she admitted, but my grandfather made sure I could read terrain like others read books. They reached the fork in the ravine where Becky had indicated, the team regrouping briefly to assess their situation. Ramirez remained stable but required careful handling through the difficult terrain. Southern branch, Becky recommended to Wilson. It'll slow our pursuers. The confined space neutralizes their numerical advantage if they follow us in. Wilson nodded, trusting her judgment. You heard the lady. Southern branch maintained tactical spacing. As they moved deeper into the narrowing passage, the sounds of pursuit grew more distant, the pursuing forces apparently opting for the more obvious northern branch, at least initially. They'll realize their mistake soon enough, Becky observed to Wilson as they navigated a particularly tight section of the ravine. We need to be through the cave system before they correct course. The ravine eventually narrowed to a point where it appeared to terminate against a solid rock face. To untrained eyes, it seemed they had reached a dead end, confirming the error of taking the southern branch. Now what? Jenkins asked, anxiety evident in his voice despite his training. Becky moved directly to the rock face, her hands exploring the surface with practiced efficiency. Geological formations in this region often include limestone cave systems created by ancient water flows, she explained, fingers finding a narrow crevice partially obscured by overhanging rock. Like this one. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to slip through sideways, invisible to casual observation, but offering access to a natural tunnel system beyond. How did you know this was here? Wilson asked, impressed despite his lingering suspicion. Pattern recognition, Becky replied. The water staining on the ravine walls, the type of rock formation, the prevailing wind direction, they all suggested an outlet had to exist. The team carefully maneuvered through the narrow entrance, Ramirez's stretcher requiring particular care to navigate the confined space. Beyond the initial restriction, the cave opened into a more navigable tunnel system, illuminated by occasional light from fissures in the rock above. Stay close to the right wall, Becky directed. Cave systems like this often branch, and we want the passage that follows the water flow. Her guidance proved accurate, leading them through the complex underground network with surprising efficiency. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they emerged into a small box canyon approximately half a kilometer from the distinctive rock formation Becky had identified earlier. We're outside their likely search perimeter now, she observed, orienting herself quickly. But we still need to establish communications and arrange extraction. Wilson attempted to reach base using their secure radio, but encountered only static. Comms are still being jammed, he reported grimly. Someone really doesn't want us calling for help. Let me try something, Becky said, removing a small device from a hidden compartment in her medical pack. It resembled a standard field radio, but with subtle modifications to its antenna and control systems. That's definitely not standard issue for a combat medic, Wilson observed, watching as she made adjustments to the device. No, she agreed simply. It's not. After a series of precise calibrations, she established a connection on a frequency well outside standard military bands. Outpost Viper, this is Morgan. Authentication Wingspan Delta 7. Require immediate extraction. Team compromised, one casualty. To everyone's surprise, an immediate response came through with perfect clarity. Morgan, this is Viper Actual. Authentication confirmed. QRF diverted to your coordinates. ETA 30 minutes. Maintain position and report any contact. The voice belonged to Colonel Harrington, speaking on a frequency that should have been affected by the jamming technology targeting standard military communications. Wilson looked at Becky with renewed intensity. That's a Bloodhawk frequency, isn't it? And Harrington knows exactly who you are. Before she could respond, Martinez called from his lookout position. Movement to the north, multiple hostiles approaching along the ridgeline. Crimson Crown had corrected their course more quickly than anticipated, deploying forces to cut off the team's projected route. We need to hold this position until extraction arrives, Wilson decided, already organizing defensive positions using the natural cover provided by the box canyon. Morgan, given your unexpected talents, I'm putting you on Overwatch, Northern Approach, highest vantage point. And the assignment represented a complete inversion of her official role, from support personnel focused on medical care to the team's primary defensive asset. But circumstances had rendered the normal chain of command irrelevant. Survival now depended on utilizing every available advantage. Becky moved to the designated position, setting up her grandfather's rifle with practiced efficiency. From this elevation, she had clear lines of fire to all likely approach routes, with natural cover protecting her from counter-sniper operations. Through the scope, she observed the approaching forces with the analytical precision of the Morgan eye. These weren't standard Taliban fighters, but professionals moving with tactical discipline, at least 12 operators deploying in coordinated fashion to establish containment positions around the box canyon. 12 hostiles, moving in tactical formation, she reported through her radio. Standard pincer approach, establishing firing positions along both ridgelines. Roger that, Wilson acknowledged. Hold fire unless they commit to an assault. Extraction inbound, priority is reaching that LZ alive. For several tense minutes, a standoff ensued, the Delta team maintaining defensive positions while Crimson Crown established a containment perimeter but refrained from direct assault. They seemed to be waiting for something. That something soon became apparent as a new helicopter approached from the east. Not a Mi-17 transport, but a smaller, more agile aircraft that Becky immediately recognized as a specialized gunship. We've got bigger problems, she informed Wilson. Attack helicopter incoming, heavily modified for special operations. Not standard military issue. Can you engage? Wilson asked, understanding the dire implications for their extraction chances if the airspace remained contested. Becky calculated range, wind, and the helicopter's likely approach pattern with cold precision. Yes, she confirmed, but I'll need to reposition for an optimal firing solution. Do it, Wilson authorized. Martinez, provide cover for Morgan's movement. With Martinez laying down suppressive fire to discourage any Crimson Crown operators from exploiting her movement, Becky relocated to a narrow ledge offering both cover and a clear line of sight to the approaching helicopter's most likely attack vector. The aircraft appeared in her scope, a civilian model extensively modified with military-grade weapon systems and sensors, painted in nondescript dark colors to minimize visibility. Its approach pattern suggested professional military piloting, establishing an attack run that would threaten the Delta team's position while remaining outside normal small arms range. But the Morgan eye didn't operate within normal parameters. Becky calculated the complex variables with intuitive speed: distance, wind speed, the helicopter's velocity, the minute adjustments needed to lead a target moving in three-dimensional space. In the space between heartbeats, she squeezed the trigger. The first shot struck precisely where she had intended, the junction between the helicopter's main rotor assembly and the transmission housing, a vulnerability she recognized from her grandfather's detailed training on aircraft weak points. The helicopter lurched violently, black smoke immediately pouring from the damaged component. The pilot fought to maintain control as the aircraft veered away from its attack run, clearly struggling with compromised flight systems. Becky's second shot targeted the engine housing, creating a catastrophic failure that sent the helicopter into an uncontrolled descent approximately half a kilometer from their position. The crash was violent but not immediately explosive, suggesting the crew might have survived but would no longer pose an immediate threat. Target neutralized, she reported calmly, already returning her attention to the Crimson Crown ground forces. Holy shit, came Jenkins' voice over the radio, awe evident despite his professional training. Did she just take down an attack helicopter with a sniper rifle? Focus on your sector, Wilson ordered, though his own voice carried a note of amazement. Extraction ETA 20 minutes. We hold until then. The loss of their air support seemed to trigger a change in Crimson Crown's tactics. Rather than maintaining the standoff, they began a coordinated assault on the Delta team's position, utilizing the cover of a sudden artillery barrage, mortar rounds impacting with precision to force the defenders into more vulnerable positions. "They're making their play," Wilson observed grimly. "Everyone maintained discipline. Morgan, priority on their support weapons." Through her scope, Becky identified the mortar team providing fire support from a concealed position approximately 600 meters to the northwest. The Morgan eye calculated the shot with characteristic precision, her finger finding the trigger at the perfect moment between heartbeats. The mortar operator fell, the shot perfectly placed despite the challenging conditions. His assistant immediately moved to continue operations, but Becky's second shot found him as well, neutralizing the fire support position that had been coordinating the assault. Without their mortar support, the Crimson Crown assault lost momentum, their carefully planned maneuver dissolving into a more cautious approach that bought precious time for the Delta team. "Extraction 60 seconds out," Wilson reported as the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters reached them. "Prepare for immediate departure." Two Black Hawks appeared over the eastern ridge, approaching with the aggressive maneuvering characteristic of combat insertions. Miniguns mounted in their doors provided suppressive fire against the Crimson Crown positions, forcing the mercenaries to seek cover rather than continue their assault. As the lead helicopter settled into a hover within the confined space of the box canyon, its crew chief directed the Delta team to board with urgent hand signals. Wilson coordinated the loading sequence, ensuring Ramirez was secured first, followed by the rest of the team in tactical withdrawal order. "Morgan, time to move," Wilson called as the second helicopter maintained a covering position, its minigun suppressing any Crimson Crown attempt to interfere with the extraction. Becky provided final covering fire from her position, ensuring her teammates could reach the helicopter safely before beginning her own movement toward extraction. As she reached the waiting Blackhawk, a single shot cracked past her, so close she felt the disturbed air against her cheek. Martinez reached out, physically pulling her into the helicopter as it began to lift. "Someone really doesn't want you to leave," he observed, gesturing toward a distant ridgeline where a faint glint suggested a sniper's optic catching the sunlight. "The feeling's mutual," Becky replied, settling into a seat as the Black Hawk gained altitude and speed, banking sharply to clear the ridgeline and establish a direct course back toward Outpost Viper. As the adrenaline of combat began to subside, the full implications of what had transpired settled over Becky. Her carefully maintained cover as a simple combat medic had been irrevocably shattered. The skills she had suppressed for 5 years, the legacy of the Morgan Eye, had emerged with undeniable clarity when circumstances demanded. Across the helicopter's cargo compartment, Wilson studied her with an unreadable expression, clearly processing the extraordinary capabilities she had demonstrated. The conversation he had promised would be uncomfortable but unavoidable once they returned to base. More concerning was the nature of their opposition. Crimson Crown had demonstrated resources and capabilities far beyond standard insurgent forces. Specialized equipment, tactical discipline, and most troublingly, advanced knowledge of Operation Iron Serpent that suggested access to classified intelligence. The brass cartridge hung heavy against Becky's chest beneath her uniform, its inscription more relevant than ever. "Shoot in the space between heartbeats. Find clarity amidst chaos. Act with perfect precision regardless of circumstance." As the Blackhawks sped toward the relative safety of Outpost Viper, Rebecca Morgan confronted a fundamental truth. The promise she had made to her grandfather, to use her skills only to heal, never to harm, had been broken by necessity. But perhaps the true meaning of his guidance lay not in rigid adherence to one aspect of her training over another, but in the harmonious integration of both the healer and the hunter that defined the Morgan legacy. The Morgan Eye had awakened fully. There would be no returning to the comfortable fiction of being merely a combat medic. Whatever came next would require embracing her complete inheritance, for better or worse. The Black Hawks thundered across the Afghan sky, maintaining maximum speed as they approached Outpost Viper. Inside the lead helicopter, the Delta team sat in exhausted silence, processing the extraordinary events of the mission. Ramirez lay secured to a medical stretcher, his condition stabilized but still serious. Wilson's gaze hadn't left Becky since their departure from the box canyon. His expression wasn't hostile, but carried the intense focus of a commander reassessing a fundamental component of his operational understanding. As the helicopters began their descent toward the outpost landing zone, Wilson moved to the seat beside her, leaning close to be heard over the rotor noise. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know something," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "You saved my men today. Whatever else you are, whatever you've been hiding, that counts for something with me." The simple acknowledgement touched Becky more deeply than she expected. "Thank you, Lieutenant." "Wilson," he corrected with the ghost of a smile. "After what we've been through, I think we're past formalities." As the helicopter touched down on the dusty landing zone, medical personnel rushed forward to transfer Ramirez to the base hospital. The rest of the team disembarked with the weary efficiency of operators returning from a high-intensity mission. Standing at the edge of the landing zone was Colonel Harrington, his silver hair ruffled by the helicopter's downwash. His expression was grave as he approached Becky and Wilson. "Debrief in my office," he instructed, without preamble. Immediately. The command center was quieter than usual, most personnel having been cleared out to allow for a private conversation. Harrington closed the door behind them, engaging an electronic countermeasure device that would prevent any electronic surveillance. "What happened out there?" he demanded once the security measures were in place. Wilson provided a concise but comprehensive report of the operation, the ambush, Becky's extraordinary shooting display, the Crimson Crown forces that had pursued them, and their narrow escape. Throughout the briefing, Harrington's attention remained fixed on Becky, his expression unreadable. "So," he said when Wilson had finished, "the Morgan eye is fully awakened." The direct reference to her family's legacy confirmed what Becky had suspected since their earlier conversation. Harrington knew far more about her background than he had previously acknowledged. "Yes, sir," she replied simply. "For the benefit of Lieutenant Wilson, perhaps you should explain exactly what that means," Harrington suggested, though his tone made it clear this was an order rather than a request. Becky looked at Wilson, measuring how much to reveal. After a moment's consideration, she decided that half-truths would no longer serve any purpose. "The Morgan eye isn't just a family saying," she began. "It's a specific genetic trait that manifests in certain members of my family. Enhanced visual processing capabilities combined with exceptional neurological integration of spatial awareness, mathematical calculation, and fine motor control." "In plain English?" Wilson prompted. "I can see and process visual information more efficiently than most people. Calculate trajectories, wind effects, and ballistic solutions almost instantaneously. Execute physical movements with precision that exceeds normal human capabilities. Like shooting down a helicopter with a sniper rifle," Wilson observed dryly. "Among other things," she acknowledged. "And your grandfather, Harold Morgan, possessed this same ability," Harrington added. "He was perhaps the most gifted Morgan in 3 generations, until you." Wilson's eyes narrowed at this additional information. "You knew about this all along," he said to Harrington. "You knew exactly who and what she was when you assigned her to my team." "I suspected," Harrington corrected. "Harold spoke of his granddaughter's potential, but claimed she had chosen a different path after his death. When I saw Specialist Morgan's file cross my desk, West Point offer declined, perfect marksmanship qualifications despite minimal documented experience, specialized medical training. I had my suspicions." "So you engineered this whole scenario," Wilson concluded, anger edging into his voice. "Assigned her to my team, sent us into a compromised operation. All to what? Force her hand? See if the Morgan eye was real?" "No," Harrington's denial was emphatic. "I assigned her to your team because I believed her medical skills would be valuable. I had no intention of exposing her other capabilities unless absolutely necessary." "Then how do you explain Crimson Crown?" Wilson challenged. "Professional mercenaries with advanced knowledge of our operation, specialized equipment, tactics that mirror our own." "That," Harrington said grimly, "is a much larger problem than either of you realize." He moved to a wall map of the region, indicating the area where they had encountered the ambush. Crimson Crown isn't just another private military company. They're a specialized direct action unit composed almost exclusively of former special operations personnel from various nations. Their leadership includes individuals who once served in classified programs that officially don't exist. "Including Bloodhawk," Becky stated, the pieces finally connecting. Harrington's eyes snapped to hers, surprise evident in his expression. Harold told you about Bloodhawk? Enough, she replied, echoing her earlier answer. He explained its origins after the Cuban Missile Crisis, its mission to prevent global catastrophe through precision intervention. And he mentioned that certain elements within the organization had become corrupted before his death. Harrington sank heavily into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. Your grandfather was more forthcoming than I realized. Yes, Specialist Morgan, Bloodhawk exists, or existed in its original form. A direct action unit operating outside conventional military channels, answerable only to a small oversight committee with representatives from defense, state, and intelligence. And Crimson Crown is what? A rogue element of Bloodhawk? Wilson asked, struggling to process the implications. More accurately, they're the enforcement arm of a corrupted faction within Bloodhawk, Harrington clarified. Individuals who diverted the organization's resources and capabilities toward private interests rather than national security. Your grandfather was investigating this corruption for his death. The reference to her grandfather's death sent a chill through Becky. His final mission to Syria, the hostage extraction, where he was killed, that wasn't a random operation going wrong, was it? Harrington's expression confirmed her suspicion before he spoke. No. Harold had gathered evidence of what he called Operation Silversmith, a systematic effort to repurpose Bloodhawk assets for corporate interests under the guise of counterterrorism operations. He believed his investigation had been detected, that certain elements within the organization were moving to eliminate him. And they succeeded, Becky concluded, the pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. The official report indicates he died protecting the extraction team when the primary plan failed, Harrington continued. But certain details never aligned with standard protocols. The team leader, Raymond Keller, reported that Harold voluntarily remained behind to cover their escape when the building was targeted by enemy fire. His body was never recovered. Keller, Becky repeated, the name triggering a memory from her grandfather's journals. Harold suspected him of being involved with the corrupted faction. Yes, Harrington confirmed, but he could never prove it definitively. After Syria, Keller disappeared from official records, presumed killed in action, though no body was ever recovered in his case either. Wilson had been listening to this exchange with growing concern. Are you telling me we're caught in the middle of some internal war between factions of a classified program that doesn't officially exist? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Lieutenant, Harrington replied grimly. And it gets worse. Crimson Crown's presence in Afghanistan isn't coincidental. They've been systematically eliminating individuals connected to Bloodhawk who might expose Operation Silversmith, making their deaths appear as casualties of the ongoing conflict. And now they have identified me as a potential threat, Becky concluded, because of my connection to Harold Morgan. Not just a potential threat, Harrington corrected. Based on their resource commitment to today's operation, they consider you a priority target. The question is why? What do they think you know? The brass cartridge felt suddenly heavy against Becky's chest. Her grandfather's final gift, passed to her at his funeral by James Harrington himself. Had it been more than a simple memento, a key to something Harold had hidden? I don't know, she answered honestly, but whatever it is, they're willing to compromise an entire special operations mission to eliminate me, risking exposure of their existence in the process. That suggests desperation. Or certainty that they can contain any fallout, Wilson suggested. An organization with these kinds of resources and connections could make inconvenient witnesses disappear, classify evidence, control the narrative. Which means none of us are safe, Harrington concluded. Not as long as we remain within conventional channels where they can track us and potentially influence operations. The implications settled over them like a heavy shroud. They were facing an adversary with access to classified intelligence, specialized resources, and potentially the ability to compromise standard military protocols. What's our next move? Wilson asked after a moment of grim silence. You and your team will receive official commendations for extraordinary performance under adverse conditions, Harrington stated. The after-action report will document an engagement with unusually well-equipped insurgent forces, with no mention of Crimson Crown or anything we've discussed here. And Morgan? Wilson pressed. Harrington's gaze shifted to Becky, his expression softening slightly. That depends on her. There are protocols for situations like this. Contingency measures your grandfather helped establish years ago. But activating them would mean completely abandoning your current identity and role. No more combat medic. No more pretending to be something you're not. The moment of decision had arrived more suddenly than Becky had anticipated. For 5 years, she had honored her promise to her grandfather by focusing exclusively on healing. But the events of Operation Iron Serpent had demonstrated with brutal clarity that the world wouldn't respect her choice to deny the other aspects of her inheritance. Before I decide, she said carefully, I need to know exactly what happened to my grandfather. The full truth, not the sanitized version from the official report. Harrington hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Harold Morgan was betrayed, he finally stated. The Syria operation was deliberately compromised to eliminate him before he could expose it Operation Silversmith. The team leader, Raymond Keller, was almost certainly involved, though the extent of his complicity remains unclear. And you, Becky challenged, fixing him with an unblinking stare. Where do you stand in all this? You were his friend, his colleague. Yet you've clearly known about the corruption within Bloodhawk for years without exposing it. The directness of the question seemed to age Harrington instantly. I've walked a dangerous line, Specialist Morgan. After your grandfather's death, I realized the extent of the corruption, but lacked the evidence to expose it through official channels. Those controlling Operation Silversmith had too much influence, too many connections in places that matter. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. So I've played the long game, maintaining my position, appearing to go along with their directives while quietly gathering evidence and protecting what remains of the original Bloodhawk network, waiting for an opportunity to expose them without being eliminated myself. And you think I'm that opportunity? Becky asked skeptically. I think you might have access to information your grandfather secured before his death, Harrington replied carefully. Harold was methodical, forward-thinking. He wouldn't have pursued something as dangerous as Silversmith without creating contingencies, securing evidence somewhere it couldn't be easily found or destroyed. The brass cartridge seemed to pulse against her skin, a physical reminder of her grandfather's final gift. Shoot in the space between heartbeats. Perhaps the inscription meant more than just marksmanship advice. Wilson, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, finally interjected. This is all fascinating, but it doesn't address our immediate tactical situation. If Crimson Crown has identified Morgan as a priority target, they won't stop with one failed attempt. They'll keep coming, potentially endangering everyone around her. Agreed, Harrington nodded, which is why we need to make a decision now. Continue as we are, hoping conventional security measures will be sufficient, which I doubt, or activate the contingency protocols Harold established for precisely this scenario. What exactly do these protocols entail? Becky asked. Emergency hardship leave, effective immediately. Transport to a secure location outside normal military channels. Access to resources that can't be traced through official systems. Harrington's expression was grave as he continued. But I have to warn you, once this process begins, there's no going back to your current life, at least not until Silversmith is exposed and neutralized. The weight of the decision settled over Becky. Everything she had built over the past 5 years, her identity as a combat medic, her professional reputation, the trust she had earned from her colleagues, would be abandoned. Yet continuing as she was would endanger not only herself but everyone around her, including the Delta team that had come to respect her. What about my mother? She asked, a practical concern suddenly surfacing. If they have identified me as a target, she could be at risk as well. Already addressed, Harrington assured her. Security detail dispatched to Ridgeway, Maine, operating undercover as property surveyors. They'll ensure Martha Morgan's safety without raising suspicions. Becky took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that characterized the Morgan eye at work. I'll do it, she stated firmly. Activate the protocols, but I want something in return. Name it, Harrington replied. Lieutenant Wilson remains informed and involved, she specified, glancing at the Delta team leader. He and his men were drawn into this without their knowledge or consent. They deserve to know what they're facing and have the opportunity to protect themselves. Wilson straightened slightly at this unexpected advocacy. I appreciate the thought, Morgan, but my team and I can handle ourselves. Not against this, she countered. Crimson Crown isn't a conventional adversary. They have resources, intelligence, and capabilities that exceed normal special operations parameters. You need to know what you're dealing with. Harrington considered the request, then nodded. Agreed. Lieutenant Wilson will be briefed on a need-to-know basis and provided with secure communication protocols separate from standard military channels. There's one more thing, Becky added. When this is over, assuming we survive, I want the truth about my grandfather officially acknowledged, not buried in classified reports or dismissed as conspiracy theories. His name cleared, his service recognized. That, Harrington said with genuine emotion, breaking through his professional demeanor, would be my honor to ensure. Harold Morgan was the finest operator I ever knew, and a better man than most. His legacy deserves recognition. With the decision made, events began moving with military efficiency. Harrington initiated the protocols with a series of encrypted communications that bypassed standard military channels. Emergency hardship leave documentation was processed with unusual speed, creating a paper trail that would withstand casual scrutiny while concealing Becky's true destination and purpose. As preparations continued, Wilson pulled Becky aside for a private conversation. You sure about this? Once you step on that transport, you are leaving behind everything you've built here. No more specialist Morgan, combat medic extraordinaire. I'm not sure about anything, she admitted, the vulnerability in her voice something she would have shown to few others. But I am certain of one thing. Continuing as I have been would put you and your team at unnecessary risk. I can't allow that. Wilson studied her face, something like respect deepening in his expression. You know, when you first joined the team, I thought you were just another support element, skilled in your specialty, but ultimately peripheral to our primary mission. I've never been so wrong about someone in my entire career. I was exactly who I presented myself to be, Becky countered. A combat medic committed to saving lives. That hasn't changed, even if the methods available to me have expanded. Fair enough, Wilson acknowledged, but I think you're finally admitting to yourself what your grandfather already knew, that the Morgan Eye isn't just about extraordinary shooting abilities. It's about seeing clearly when others can't or won't, recognizing patterns others miss, making connections that change the course of events. The insight surprised her, revealing a depth of perception she hadn't expected from the hardened Delta operator. You sound like you knew him. Never had the honor, Wilson replied, but I recognize the type. The quiet professionals who shape history from the shadows, whose greatest victories are the disasters that never happened because they acted first. From what Harrington's told me, your grandfather was one of the best. He was, Becky agreed, unexpected emotion tightening her throat. And I spent 5 years trying to honor his memory by denying half of what he taught me. Maybe the true honor is in embracing all of it, Wilson suggested. The healer and the hunter, two sides of the same purpose, protecting those who need protection, by whatever means necessary. His words resonated with something deep within her, a truth she had been approaching since the moment she first reached for that rifle in the Kunar Valley. Perhaps her grandfather's final lesson wasn't about choosing one path over another, but about integrating all aspects of her training into a harmonious whole. The brass cartridge hung warm against her skin, its inscription suddenly clearer than ever. Shoot in the space between heartbeats. Find perfect clarity amidst case. Act with perfect precision, whether saving a life or taking one. The Morgan Eye encompassed both aspects of her nature, neither complete without the other. Whatever happens next, Wilson said, extending his hand, it's been an honor serving with you, Morgan. She took his hand, the simple gesture carrying the weight of mutual respect earned in the crucible of combat. Likewise, Wilson, keep your team safe. And you find out who killed your grandfather, he replied, his expression hardening. Some debts can only be paid one way. As the transport prepared for departure, Becky found herself standing at the threshold of a fundamental transformation. The combat medic who had deployed to Afghanistan, determined to save lives while honoring her promise, had evolved into something more complex and complete. A true heir to the Morgan legacy, embracing both the healer's compassion and the hunter's precision that defined her family's unique gift. The brass cartridge hung against her skin as she boarded the aircraft, a physical reminder of the inheritance she now fully accepted. The Morgan eye was awakened, and Rebecca Morgan was finally ready to fulfill the destiny her grandfather had always foreseen. The hunt for truth and justice was about to begin. The military transport touched down at Ramstein Air Base under the cover of darkness. Becky disembarked into the cool German night, a stark contrast to Afghanistan's dry heat. An unmarked black sedan waited at the edge of the runway, its driver standing beside the open rear door. "Ms. Morgan," he greeted her with a slight German accent. "Colonel Harrington sends his regards." "And you are?" she asked, making no move toward the vehicle. "Kleinund," he replied. Authentication phrase. "The white pine stands tallest in October wind." The phrase matched the emergency protocol Harrington had provided. Still, the Morgan eye didn't miss the subtle bulge beneath his weathered jacket, a sidearm, professionally concealed but evident to her trained perception. After 90 minutes of driving through the rain-slicked German countryside, they arrived at what appeared to be a modest hunting lodge nestled in a dense forest. Inside, however, the building revealed its true purpose. Beneath rustic furnishings and hunting trophies lay state-of-the-art security systems and tactical resources that would have impressed even the most demanding special operations team. The monitor flickered to life, revealing Harrington's face, the lighting suggesting he was still in his office at Outpost Viper, despite the late hour in Afghanistan. "Morgan," he greeted her. He greeted. "Glad to see you made it safely." "Nothing about this seems improvised," she observed. "Your contingency protocols are remarkably well established." A ghost of a smile crossed Harrington's weathered face. "Your grandfather established these emergency measures years ago, anticipating a scenario where Bloodhawk assets might be compromised." "I'm listening," she said, settling into the chair before the monitor. "Operation Silversmith was only part of what your grandfather uncovered," Harrington began, his expression darkening. "Before his death, he identified an even more disturbing initiative within the corrupted elements of Bloodhawk, something codenamed Project Nightshade. According to the fragments of intelligence Harold managed to gather, Nightshade represented a fundamental perversion of Bloodhawk's original mission," Harrington continued. "Instead of preventing conflicts through targeted intervention, Nightshade actively manufactured crises to create opportunities for corporate's interests." "Manufactured how?" Becky asked, though she already suspected the answer. "False flag operations, targeted assassinations disguised as terrorist incidents, destabilization of legitimate governments that oppose specific resource extraction projects or trade agreements." Harrington's voice lowered. "But what truly disturbed your grandfather was discovering Nightshade's American operations." "American operations?" Becky's attention sharpened. "November 22nd, 1963, Harrington stated grimly. "Dallas, Texas." The date registered immediately, a pivotal moment in American history that had shaped the nation's trajectory for decades. "Are you suggesting Bloodhawk was involved in Kennedy's assassination?" Becky asked, skepticism evident in her tone. "Not Bloodhawk as it was originally conceived," Harrington clarified, "but elements that would later evolve into Project Nightshade. Your grandfather found documentation suggesting certain corporate interests used early-stage Bloodhawk assets to eliminate a president whose policies threatened their financial objectives." Becky processed this revelation with the cold precision of the Morgan eye. If true, it represented not just corruption within a classified program, but a fundamental threat to American democracy itself. "And Crimson Crown?" she prompted. "Nightshade's modern enforcement arm," Harrington confirmed, "composed primarily of former special operations personnel who were either compromised through financial incentives or manipulated through falsified intelligence." "Led by Raymond Keller," Becky added, the pieces connecting with cold clarity in her mind. "The man who was supposedly with my grandfather when he died in Syria." "So the Syria mission wasn't just compromised," Becky concluded, the truth crystallizing with painful clarity. "It was deliberately engineered to eliminate my grandfather before he could expose Project Nightshade." "That's my assessment," Harrington agreed grimly. Harold had gathered compelling evidence and was preparing to present it to specific members of the oversight committee he still trusted. "You said he gathered evidence," she noted, focusing on the practical implications rather than the emotional impact. What happened to it after his death? That's the critical question, Harrington replied. Harold maintained physical documentation, often disguised within seemingly innocuous items or locations. Understanding dawned as Becky's hand unconsciously rose to the brass cartridge hanging beneath her shirt. The spaces between heartbeats, she murmured. I need to get back to Maine, Becky stated, decision crystallizing in her mind. Whatever my grandfather hid, I need to find it before they do. Agreed, but I must emphasize the danger, Morgan. Raymond Keller personally leads the Crimson Crown team in Ridgeway. He's one of the most lethal operators Bloodhawk ever produced. The man who likely killed my grandfather, Becky observed, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying the statement. There's one more thing you should know, Harrington added after a moment's hesitation. Intelligence suggests Keller wasn't alone in betraying your grandfather. There were other Bloodhawk operatives involved, individuals Harold trusted, who ultimately sided with Nightshade. Including? Becky prompted, sensing his reluctance to continue. Harrington met her gaze directly. I don't have confirmed names, but Harold's final communication to me indicated he had identified a high-level betrayal within his inner circle. The implication hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Trust no one completely, not even those claiming to support her mission. The coastal highway unfurled before Becky like a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the autumn splendor of Maine's forests. As she approached the familiar terrain of Ridgeway, a weathered sign welcomed visitors to the town. Ridgeway, Maine, Est 1776, where America's freedom took root. Instead of proceeding directly to known Morgan properties, Becky took a deliberate detour through downtown Ridgeway, a single main street lined with brick buildings dating back to the 19th century, American flags hanging from nearly every storefront. She parked near Harrigan's Hardware, a family-owned establishment that had served the community since before her grandfather's birth. As she stepped from the vehicle, a familiar voice called her name. Not her cover identity, but her actual name. Becky Morgan, is that really you? She turned to find Frank Caldwell approaching with the measured gait of a man who had spent decades adapting to a prosthetic leg. At 78, Frank remained broad-shouldered and imposing despite his age, his weathered face bearing the distinctive scars of combat long past. Mr. Caldwell, she greeted him, genuine warmth in her voice despite the tactical complications his recognition created. It's been years. Too many, he agreed, his handshake firm as ever. Not since Harold's funeral, I reckon. Frank Caldwell represented both opportunity and risk in her current situation. A Marine Corps veteran who had served in Vietnam, he had been her grandfather's closest friend in Ridgeway, the one civilian who knew something of Harold Morgan's true profession. Just passing through? Frank asked, his shrewd eyes suggesting he suspected otherwise. Something like that, Becky replied noncommittally. Family matters. Frank nodded, apparently accepting her vague explanation. Well, if you need anything while you're in town, you know where to find me, still in the same house on Veterans Road. I appreciate that, she said, preparing to continue her reconnaissance. Frank's voice lowered as he added, might want to know there's been strangers around town lately. City types asking questions about the Morgan property. Government men, they claim, but they don't move like bureaucrats. The information confirmed Crimson Crown's presence in Ridgeway extended beyond the specific locations she had already identified. Thanks for the heads up, she replied, her tone casual despite the tactical significance of his observation. Your grandfather would have noticed them too, Frank added with meaningful emphasis. Always had an eye for details others missed. Speaking of details, he continued, maintaining the conversational tone while subtly scanning their surroundings. Found something interesting while clearing out my attic last month. Old map from when your grandfather and I went hunting back in '83. Marked with his notes about terrain features most folks wouldn't notice. Thought you might want it, given your family's interest in such things. The offer wasn't casual conversation but deliberate communication. Frank was indicating he had information relevant to her mission. I'd appreciate that, she acknowledged. Maybe I'll stop by later today. Door's always open for Harold Morgan's granddaughter, Frank assured her. And Becky, watch yourself around those strangers. They may claim to be government, but your grandfather taught me there's government, and then there's government, if you take my meaning. The warning confirmed Frank understood more about Harold's activities than she had previously assumed. Perhaps her grandfather had established contingency measures involving his old friend, trusted resources outside official channels that could provide support if Bloodhawk itself became compromised. As evening approached, Becky prepared for nighttime movement to the White Pine Ridge where her grandfather had first acknowledged and developed the Morgan Eye. Moving through the dense forest with practiced silence, she approached the ridge from an indirect vector that minimized exposure to potential observation. The specific location marked on Harold's map corresponded to a distinctive formation of white pines arranged in a rough semicircle around a natural clearing. It was here, at age 8, that Becky had first held a rifle under her grandfather's guidance, learning to find the stillness between heartbeats that enabled precision beyond normal human capability. The Morgan Eye detected subtle inconsistencies in the terrain, patterns in the forest floor that suggested periodic disturbance, despite the apparent undisturbed nature of the clearing. Focusing on these anomalies, Becky identified a section of ground near the base of the largest pine that showed different compression characteristics than the surrounding soil. Using techniques Harold had taught her for concealed excavation, she carefully removed the surface layer of forest debris, revealing a small metal plate approximately 6 inches square, its surface treated to resist corrosion and blend with the surrounding environment. The plate incorporated no obvious opening mechanism, no hinges, latches, or seams that might allow access to whatever lay beneath. Instead, its surface contained a subtle pattern of small depressions arranged in a configuration that seemed vaguely familiar. After studying the pattern for several moments, recognition dawned. The arrangement matched the position of stars in Ursa Major, the constellation Harold had used to teach her celestial navigation during overnight training exercises. Pressing the depressions in the sequence Harold had taught her for identifying the stars of Ursa Major, Becky felt a slight give in the mechanism, followed by a soft click as the plate unlocked. Lifting it revealed a small waterproof case nestled in a concrete enclosure beneath, protected from environmental degradation but accessible to someone who knew exactly where to look and how to access it. The case contained a USB drive, a small journal bound in weathered leather, and most surprisingly, a vintage Polaroid photograph showing Harold Morgan standing beside a much younger Raymond Keller. Both men wore nondescript tactical clothing, their expressions serious but companionable, clearly colleagues on an operation predating Keller's betrayal. Written on the back of the photograph in Harold's distinctive handwriting was a single line: Operation Long Shadow, 1991, the day America nearly fell again. The journal provided context that sent a chill through Becky, despite the mild autumn night. Its pages detailed Harold Morgan's growing concerns about Bloodhawk's changing mission parameters, beginning with subtle shifts in operational priorities and culminating in specific instances where intelligence had been manipulated to justify interventions that served corporate rather than national security interests. The most disturbing entries focused on Operation Long Shadow, a 91 mission that Harold and Keller had undertaken together in Dallas, Texas. According to the journal, they had been tasked with preventing what Bloodhawk leadership described as a domestic terrorist threat, targeting the 28th anniversary memorial service for President Kennedy. Only after the operation did Harold discover the truth. The supposed terrorists were actually investigative journalists who had uncovered documentation linking certain corporate interests to the 1963 assassination. Bloodhawk had been manipulated into silencing legitimate investigation that threatened to expose historical crimes. As she secured the recovered materials in her pack, the sound of approaching movement triggered immediate tactical awareness. Someone was approaching her position with professional stealth, minimizing acoustic signature while maintaining efficient progress through difficult terrain. The Morgan Eye calculated optimal response options as Becky assumed defensive position, weapon ready but not yet visible. The approaching figure emerged from the forest shadows with the distinctive movement pattern of elite special operations training, deliberate, efficient, constantly assessing surroundings for potential threats. "Morgan," Lieutenant Wilson's voice came softly through the darkness. "It's me." His appearance at her exact location without prior coordination raised immediate security concerns. How had he found her? "That's close enough," she stated firmly, her weapon now visible and oriented toward potential threat. "Explain how you found this location." Wilson froze, recognizing the implied threat in her tone and posture. Harrington provided coordinates for likely evidence caches based on your grandfather's operational patterns. This ridge was highest probability given its significance to your training. The explanation was plausible but inconsistent with established security protocols. Harrington shouldn't have known about this specific location unless he had information not shared through their secure communications. "What's the situation in town?" she asked, maintaining defensive positioning while gathering critical intelligence. "Worse than anticipated," Wilson reported with professional concision. Crimson Crown has deployed significant resources, at least 20 operators across multiple locations, advanced surveillance capabilities, localized communications interference in certain areas. Leadership? Keller is personally directing operations from the Ridgeway Inn. He's brought in specialized assets beyond standard Crimson Crown operators. The information aligned with her own intelligence assessment, suggesting Wilson was indeed operating with legitimate knowledge of the current situation. After careful consideration, Becky made a tactical decision to accept his presence as potentially valuable while maintaining appropriate security measures. "We need to move," she stated, holstering her weapon but maintaining tactical awareness. "The Peterson property is our primary objective based on my grandfather's guidance." Wilson nodded his agreement. "I've established temporary safe position approximately 3 miles from here, isolated cabin owned by a former Delta colleague. We can use it for operational planning before approaching the Peterson property." As they prepared to depart the clearing, Wilson's satellite phone vibrated with an incoming message. His expression darkened as he read the communication. "Harrington reports Crimson Crown has accelerated their search pattern," he informed her. "They've identified several previously unknown Morgan properties in the Ridgeway area. Peterson Farm isn't on their current search grid, but estimated timeline for identifying it has shortened from days to hours." "We move tonight," Becky decided, the Morgan eye calculating optimal approach vectors based on terrain features and likely Crimson Crown deployment patterns. "What's our approach vector for the farm?" Wilson asked, transitioning to operational planning. "Eastern approach through the ravine system," she indicated, tracing the route with her finger. "Minimal elevation exposure, consistent tree cover, natural water features to mask acoustic signatures." "I know another way," came a gravelly voice from behind them. Both Becky and Wilson spun, weapons instantly ready, to find Frank Caldwell standing at the edge of the clearing. His approach had been completely silent, an extraordinary feat for a man of his age with a prosthetic leg. "How did you," Wilson began. "Your grandfather wasn't the only one who knew how to move through these woods," Frank said to Becky, ignoring Wilson entirely. "Been hunting this land since before either of you were born." "How did you find us?" Becky asked, the Morgan eye assessing Frank's unexpected appearance with cautious precision. "Figured you'd come here first," Frank replied simply. "This ridge meant something special to Harold. Was here the day he first put a rifle in your hands." The reference to that specific memory, one that wouldn't appear in any official record, confirmed Frank's legitimacy as a trusted connection to her grandfather. "You mentioned another way to the Peterson farm," Becky prompted, maintaining tactical focus despite the surprising development. "Underground access tunnel connecting the old Miller property to Peterson's root cellar," Frank explained, "built during Prohibition for moving illegal liquor. Harold reinforced it years ago as an emergency extraction route." The information represented significant tactical advantage, a secure approach option unknown to Crimson Crown that would allow them to access the Peterson property without risking detection during external approach. The well house appeared exactly as Frank had described, a weathered structure of gray stone that local residents would recognize as a relic from the property's agricultural past. Nothing in its exterior appearance suggested it concealed the entrance to a reinforced tunnel providing covert access to the Peterson property nearly 2 miles away. "Activation sequence is based on prime numbers," Frank explained, demonstrating the specific pattern of pressure points within the well's stone lining. Harold redesigned it after studying ancient Mayan mathematical systems, said it was beautiful because it looked completely random to anyone who didn't understand the underlying pattern. The mechanism engaged with a soft hydraulic hiss, revealing a concrete passage illuminated by emergency lighting that activated automatically upon entry. The tunnel itself represented remarkable engineering, reinforced walls capable of withstanding significant structural stress, ventilation systems that maintained consistent air quality, and most impressively, security features that would alert authorized users to any unauthorized access attempts. After providing final guidance regarding the tunnel's layout and potential security considerations, Frank prepared to depart, his role in their mission complete. Before leaving, he placed a weathered hand on Becky's shoulder. "Your grandfather was the finest man I ever knew," he said, emotion evident beneath his military bearing. "Whatever he was fighting against, whatever he discovered that cost him his life, it must have been something that threatened everything he believed this country stands for." "It was," Becky confirmed simply. "Then finish what he started," Frank stated, with the moral clarity that had defined his generation's approach to duty and sacrifice. "Some truths need to be told, no matter how uncomfortable or dangerous they might be. That's what makes America different. Our willingness to face our own failures as well as celebrate our triumphs." With that final guidance, Frank Caldwell departed, returning to his ordinary appearing home that concealed extraordinary connections to America's shadow history. The tunnel extended nearly 2 miles, its path occasionally incorporating natural cave formations that predated human settlement in the region. Throughout its length, the Morgan eye detected subtle security measures her grandfather had installed: motion sensors disguised as natural rock formations, pressure plates concealed beneath seemingly ordinary sections of flooring, environmental monitoring systems that would detect unauthorized presence through changes in air composition. After 40 minutes of careful progress, they reached the tunnel's terminus, a reinforced access point leading directly into the root cellar beneath the Peterson farmhouse. Another biometric security system verified Becky's genetic identity before allowing entry to the secure facility her grandfather had established beyond the seemingly decrepit exterior. The contrast was striking: 19th century root cellar giving way to 21st century secure facility with no transitional space between them. Harold Morgan had created the ultimate concealment through deliberate juxtaposition of apparent abandonment against cutting-edge security. The interior space represented a complete intelligence operations center, secure communications equipment, advanced data processing capabilities, comprehensive archival systems for both physical and digital information. More striking was the wall of surveillance monitors displaying real-time imagery from locations throughout Ridgeway, including Morgan's fuel stop, the family home, and most surprisingly, the Ridgeway Inn that Wilson had identified as Crimson Crown's operational headquarters. He established surveillance on his own property, Wilson noted, studying the monitor displays with professional assessment, maintained through independent systems even after his death. The monitors revealed concerning developments at several locations: increased Crimson Crown activity at Morgan's fuel stop, additional personnel arriving at their Ridgeway Inn headquarters, and most significantly, a tactical team preparing for deployment at the motel's rear entrance. "They're mobilizing significant resources," Wilson observed, studying the tactical team's equipment and movement patterns. Night operation deployment suggesting specific intelligence rather than continued general search pattern. The central chamber contained a comprehensive archival system, physical documentation organized with military precision, digital storage incorporating redundant security measures, and most significantly, a secured vault requiring additional biometric authentication for access. Completing the genetic verification process, Becky opened the vault to reveal its contents: multiple external hard drives in protective casings, document folders organized chronologically, and most surprisingly, a series of audio recording devices, suggesting her grandfather had maintained extensive documentation of conversations related to Project Nightshade. As they began organizing the materials for transport, Wilson discovered something that transformed their understanding of the situation: a surveillance photograph showing him in conversation with Raymond Keller 3 days earlier in Washington, D.C. The image froze him in place, the implications immediately apparent in his expression. Becky's weapon was leveled at his center mass before he could formulate a response. "Explain," she demanded, the Morgan eye calculating optimal firing solution while maintaining tactical positioning that prevented him from reaching his own weapon. Wilson raised his hand slowly, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "It's not what it looks like, Morgan. It looks like you're working with the Poe who killed my grandfather," she replied, her voice deadly calm, despite the betrayal evident in the photograph. "I'm not working with him," Wilson insisted, maintaining eye contact despite the weapon aimed at his heart. I was approached by him. There's a difference. Explain the difference, Becky demanded, finger steady on the trigger. After Afghanistan, after what I saw you do during Operation Iron Serpent, I started asking questions. Wilson began, his words measured and precise. Questions about what Bloodhawk really was, about why Harrington seemed to know so much about your capabilities. He gestured toward the photograph with careful movements that avoided any threatening posture. Keller approached me 3 days ago, claiming to represent an oversight committee investigating corruption within classified programs. He showed me documentation suggesting Harrington had manipulated you into pursuing a personal vendetta rather than legitimate national security concerns. And you believed him? The incredulity in her tone was evident. I didn't know what to believe, Wilson admitted. That's why I agreed to meet with him, to assess his credibility, to gather intelligence that might help determine where the truth actually lay. Why keep this from me, she pressed, weapons still trained on his center mass. Because I wasn't sure who to trust, Wilson replied simply. Harrington telling one story, Keller another, your grandfather's warnings about trusting no one completely. I needed to see the evidence for myself before making any definitive judgment. As if on cue, an alert from the surveillance system drew their attention to the monitors. Multiple vehicles were approaching the Peterson property from different directions. The tactical team they had observed preparing at the Ridgeway Inn, now converging on their location with evident urgency and purpose. They found us, Wilson observed grimly, either through tracking my movements or through separate intelligence. We need to move, Becky decided, the Morgan eye calculating optimal extraction options based on the approaching threat. Take only the essential documentation. Prioritize the recordings and financial records linking Project Nightshade to specific corporate entities. Wilson nodded his agreement, already shifting to operational mode despite the weapon still oriented toward him. The tunnel provides our best extraction route, assuming they haven't identified it yet. You're taking the evidence through the tunnel, she stated, her decision clearly not open to negotiation. I'm staying to ensure you have time to clear the area with the documentation. Wilson's expression registered immediate objection. That's tactically unsound. We both go, or we both stay. This isn't a democracy, Lieutenant, she replied, using his military rank deliberately to emphasize the chain of command in this particular situation. The evidence is what matters, proof of Project Nightshade's corruption and the corporate interests controlling it. Getting that to the right people is the primary mission's objective. And what about you, Wilson challenged. You're just going to sacrifice yourself as a delaying action? A cold smile touched Becky's lips, an expression that transformed her features into something reminiscent of her grandfather at his most determined. Who said anything about sacrifice? Keller isn't the only one who's been planning for this confrontation. Understanding dawned in Wilson's eyes as he realized her intention. You're going to engage him directly. Make this personal rather than tactical. It's always been personal, she confirmed, from the moment he betrayed my grandfather in Syria. The difference is that I'm prepared for this confrontation in ways he can't anticipate. The farmhouse door splintered inward under the focused impact of a breaching charge, releasing a cloud of ancient dust into the autumn night. Crimson Crown operators flowed through the opening with practiced efficiency, tactical movement optimized for room clearing in potentially hostile environments. From her position within the hidden facility beneath the root cellar, Becky observed their methodical search through the surveillance system her grandfather had installed throughout the property. The operators moved with the confidence of professionals who believed their intelligence was accurate and their tactical advantage secured. Raymond Keller entered last, his expression revealing nothing as he surveyed the farmhouse interior. Unlike his operators with their tactical gear and visible weapons, he wore simple civilian clothing, dark pants and jacket over a gray button-down shirt. No visible body armor or equipment beyond a compact sidearm holstered beneath his left arm. After the operators had cleared the main structure, reporting no significant findings or indications of recent occupation, Keller directed them to expand their search to the surrounding outbuildings and potential subsurface structures. When one particularly observant operator identified the root cellar entrance as deserving closer inspection, Keller nodded his approval of the assessment. The moment had arrived. Becky activated the first of her grandfather's specialized security measures, a carefully calibrated electromagnetic pulse that disabled communication equipment within a specific radius of the facility. The operator's radio transmissions ceased mid-sentence, their tactical coordination suddenly compromised by the loss of electronic communication. As the operators prepared to breach the root cellar entrance, Becky initiated the second phase of her tactical plan. The seemingly ordinary wooden doors were actually sophisticated composite materials designed to channel explosive force in specific directions, redirecting the breaching charge's energy away from the cellar's interior while creating a controlled debris field that would separate Keller from his tactical team. The breach executed exactly as she had anticipated. The specialized doors channeled the explosion upward and outward, temporarily disorienting the entry team while leaving the actual entrance largely intact. More importantly, the controlled debris pattern created a momentary separation between the operators and Keller, a tactical window she had carefully calculated. Using the facility's environmental controls, Becky filled the root cellar with dense but non-toxic smoke, further disorienting the entry team while creating optimal conditions for the Morganized superior visual processing capabilities. When Keller himself entered the root cellar, separated from his team by the engineered circumstances of the breach, Becky activated the final element of her grandfather's security system, a specialized containment protocol that sealed the disguised entrance to the secure facility beneath, isolating Keller from his operators while revealing the actual objective of their search. The hidden wall section receded and slid aside, revealing the sophisticated facility beyond, and Rebecca Morgan waiting within, her grandfather's custom rifle held with the relaxed confidence of someone who had found the perfect stillness between heartbeats. "Hello, Raymond," she greeted him calmly. "I've been expecting you." Keller showed no surprise at finding her waiting, only a cold professional assessment as he evaluated the tactical situation. His hand remained deliberately away from his holstered sidearm, recognizing the disadvantage of his position given her established firing solution. "Rebecca Morgan," he acknowledged, his voice carrying the distinctive timbre of absolute self-control. "Harold's granddaughter, though I see more of him in you than just the genetic resemblance." "The Morgan eye," she confirmed, the rifle's muzzle unwavering despite the conversational tone. "Though you've never really understood what that means, have you?" A flicker of something, perhaps genuine curiosity, crossed his features. Exceptional visual processing capabilities, unprecedented marksmanship potential, Harold's genetic gift to his descendants. "That's the fundamental misconception my grandfather referenced in his notes," Becky replied, allowing a cold smile. "The Morgan eye isn't just about seeing better than others. It's about processing information differently, recognizing patterns others miss, calculating probabilities with mathematical precision, anticipating decisions before they're implemented." Understanding dawned in Keller's expression as he reassessed the tactical situation, recognizing that she hadn't merely predicted his approach to the Peterson property, but had engineered the specific circumstances of their confrontation to neutralize his advantages while maximizing her own. "You betrayed him," she stated, the rifle remaining steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "In Syria. You deliberately compromised the operation to eliminate him before he could expose what Nightshade had become." For the first time, genuine emotion crossed Keller's features, not guilt or remorse, but something more complex. "Harold was my friend," he said quietly. "For 20 years, we served together in operations across 4 continents. I respected him more than any man I've ever known." "Yet you arranged his death," Becky pressed, determined to extract the admission her grandfather had never received. "I arranged for his retirement," Keller corrected, his expression hardening. The extraction plan included contingencies for removing him from operational status without public exposure. He was supposed to be captured, held temporarily, then released after Nightshade was secured against his allegations. "But something went wrong," Becky concluded, the Morgan eye detecting the subtle indicators of rationalization in his body language and vocal patterns. "He recognized the trap," Keller acknowledged, a hint of genuine admiration entering his voice. Even with everything arranged to appear as standard operational parameters, Harold sensed the disruption in pattern. When the building was targeted, he knew it wasn't random enemy fire but deliberate elimination protocol. So he sacrificed himself to save the team, Becky finished, the final pieces of her grandfather's death falling into place with painful clarity, covering their extraction while ensuring the hostages' safety. It's what made him extraordinary, Keller confirmed, his expression suggesting this justification had allowed him to live with his actions in the years since. Even knowing he'd been betrayed, Harold's final act was to protect others, the same principle that had guided his entire career. Tell me about Operation Long Shadow, Becky demanded, shifting the conversation to the mission documented in her grandfather's journal. Dallas, 1991, when you and my grandfather were sent to eliminate journalists investigating Kennedy's assassination. Keller's face registered genuine surprise, the first crack in his professional composure. How do you know about Long Shadow? Those files were purged from all systems. My grandfather kept his own records, Becky replied, including documentation of how Bloodhawk was manipulated into silencing legitimate investigation that threatened to expose historical crimes. That operation was the turning point for Harold, Keller admitted after a moment's hesitation. When he began questioning the directives we received, investigating the actual motivations behind our missions. And when you chose a different path, Becky observed, embracing the corruption rather than fighting it. I chose pragmatism over idealism, Keller countered, his tone suggesting he still believed in his justification. Harold never understood that principles don't pay operational costs. Bloodhawk needed financial support beyond what government budgets could provide, especially after the Cold War ended and congressional oversight increased. So you sold America's most elite intelligence asset to corporate interests, Becky stated, the contempt evident in her voice despite her controlled demeanor. Turned it from protecting national security to generating private profit. What happens now, Rebecca? Keller asked, though the Morgan eye had already calculated the most probable progression of events with mathematical precision. Now we conclude this unfortunate situation, he replied with the confident finality of someone who believed victory was assured despite temporary tactical disadvantage. My team has secured the perimeter of this property. No evidence leaves this facility. The Peterson farm will suffer an unfortunate structural fire attributed to decaying electrical systems in an abandoned property. And me, Becky pressed, though she already knew his intended resolution. A similar unfortunate accident during your unauthorized investigation of the property, Keller stated without emotion. Tragic, but ultimately a footnote in classified operational records that will never see public scrutiny. His confidence confirmed he remained unaware of the facility's most important security feature, the comprehensive recording system documenting their entire conversation, transmitting to secure servers beyond Crimson Crown's reach. Whatever happened within these walls, the truth about Project Nightshade and Raymond Keller's role in Harold Morgan's death would reach the appropriate authorities. There's a fundamental flaw in your tactical assessment, Becky noted, allowing a hint of her grandfather's characteristic intensity to enter her expression. You've calculated based on the assumption that I came here to escape with evidence. That was never my objective. Confusion flickered briefly across Keller's features, the first genuine tactical uncertainty he had displayed during their confrontation. Explain. I came here to ensure the evidence reached the right people, she clarified. That objective was accomplished approximately 12 minutes ago when Lieutenant Wilson cleared the property through an extraction route your teams haven't identified. Keller's expression hardened as he processed this information, recognizing its tactical implications. You're bluffing. Wilson would never leave you behind for a solo extraction. He would when presented with direct orders and the operational necessity of securing primary mission objectives, Becky countered. The evidence documenting Project Nightshade, including your role in my grandfather's death, is beyond your reach now. As this reality registered in Keller's tactical assessment, his hand moved with practiced smoothness towards his holstered sidearm, the motion so fluid and precise that most observers would have been unable to react effectively. But the Morgan eye wasn't limited by ordinary human perception. Becky had calculated this exact response sequence, anticipated the precise moment when Keller would transition from conversation to direct action. She didn't fire. Instead, she pressed a small device concealed in her palm, activating the final contingency her grandfather had built into the facility. Specialized panels in the floor beneath Keller slid open, dropping him into a containment chamber before he could complete his draw. The transition was so rapid and unexpected that even his exceptional reflexes couldn't compensate. Through an observation window in the adjacent wall, Becky watched as Keller recovered his balance in the sealed chamber, his expression registering the complete reversal of tactical advantage. "Your grandfather always was fond of misdirection," Keller observed, a hint of grudging admiration in his voice despite his compromised position, making opponents focus on one threat while the real danger came from an unexpected direction. "He taught me well," Becky confirmed, lowering her rifle now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. "Though I suspect he would have approved of my restraint. Harold believed justice was more important than vengeance, that exposing the truth ultimately mattered more than personal retribution." "What happens now?" Keller asked, his tone suggesting he had already calculated the most likely outcomes of his situation. "Now you face accountability for your actions," Becky replied simply. "Not just elimination in some classified facility, but formal justice for betraying everything Bloodhawk was created to protect." "You're more naive than your grandfather if you believe that's possible," Keller countered, his expression hardening. "The people behind Project Nightshade have connections throughout government, intelligence communities, corporate boardrooms. They don't just disappear because one operative is captured." "You're right," Becky acknowledged, "which is why the evidence Wilson extracted doesn't just document your actions, but identifies every member of the Oversight Committee, the corporate executives who transformed Bloodhawk from protecting America to serving private interests." For the first time, genuine fear crossed Raymond Keller's features. The recognition that his decades of operating in shadows had culminated in comprehensive exposure. Whatever happened physically within this facility, his actions and Nightshade's corruption had been irrevocably documented for appropriate authorities to address. "He outplayed us both," Keller observed with grim acknowledgement. "Harold, even from beyond the grave, he anticipated exactly how this would unfold." "The Morgan eye sees what others miss," Becky confirmed, her grandfather's wisdom finding final validation in this moment of truth. "Even across generations." Activating the facility's communication system, Becky sent a coded message to the extraction team Frank Caldwell had positioned nearby, local veterans who had served with her grandfather decades earlier, men whose loyalty to Harold Morgan transcended official channels or government directives. "My grandfather left one final message for you," Becky told Keller as they waited for the extraction team to secure the facility. "He said to remind you of what he told you in Berlin, 1989. The truth doesn't expire with the messenger. It finds new voices with each generation." Recognition flickered in Keller's eyes. The memory of a conversation decades earlier when both men had still served the original Bloodhawk mission with shared purpose and principles, before corruption had transformed one while strengthening the other's resolve. As the extraction team secured the facility, neutralizing the remaining Crimson Crown operators through tactical surprise and superior position, Becky prepared for the complex transition that would follow, ensuring Keller and the evidence of Project Nightshade reached the appropriate authorities rather than disappearing into the classified void where accountability died. The brass cartridge hung warm against her skin, its inscription carrying deeper meaning than she had initially recognized. "Shoot in the space between heartbeats. Find perfect clarity amidst complexity. Act with precise purpose rather than reactive emotion. See not just what is, but what could be." Her grandfather's guidance had found its ultimate fulfillment, not merely in marksmanship precision, but in the perfect clarity with which she had navigated the moral complexity of confronting her grandfather's killer. The Morgan eye had seen beyond immediate tactical considerations to the generational purpose Harold had always intended, using their unique capabilities not for personal vengeance, but for protecting the principles that defined America at its best, even when those principles were threatened from within. 6 months later, Becky stood at the edge of Arlington National Cemetery, watching as the honor guard completed the ceremony that Harold Morgan had been denied in death but finally received in legacy. The official recognition of his service, amended to acknowledge his role in Bloodhawk operations spanning 3 decades, represented partial justice for a man whose dedication to principle had ultimately cost him his life. Frank Caldwell stood beside her, his weathered face solemn beneath his Marine Corps veteran's cap. Behind them, a small group of aging men represented the surviving members of Harold's original Bloodhawk team, operators who had maintained their loyalty to the organization's founding principles, despite the corruption that had eventually infiltrated its leadership. He would have hated all this ceremony, Frank observed quietly, as the last notes of taps faded across the hallowed grounds. Harold always said true service happens in the shadows, not under spotlights. True, Becky acknowledged with a slight smile, but he would have appreciated the accountability it represents, proof that the system can correct itself when good people insist on truth. The congressional hearings examining Project Nightshade had been conducted largely behind closed doors, given the classified nature of Bloodhawk operations, but their outcomes had been significant. Raymond Keller now faced prosecution for his role in Harold Morgan's death, while the corporate executives who had comprised the oversight committee were being systematically investigated for their subversion of classified intelligence assets. More importantly, the structural vulnerabilities that had allowed Project Nightshade to develop were being addressed through comprehensive reforms, creating accountability mechanisms that would have prevented such corruption had they existed decades earlier. Colonel Harrington asked about your decision, Frank mentioned as they walked slowly back toward the cemetery's entrance. Said the position remains open if you want it. The reference was to the leadership role Harrington had proposed within the restored Bloodhawk structure, specifically as Director of Operational Integrity, a new position with direct oversight authority for all field activities and mission parameters. I'm still considering it, Becky replied honestly. Part of me wants it to return to being just a combat medic, focusing on saving lives directly rather than through institutional oversight. And the other part? Frank prompted, his perceptiveness reminding her of her grandfather. The other part recognizes what my grandfather always intended, she admitted, that the Morgan eye exists to see clearly what others might miss, ensuring power serves principle rather than the reverse. Frank nodded his understanding, his expression reflecting the values of a generation that had fought for principles rather than expediency. Harold used to say there are two kinds of warriors, those who fight because they hate what stands before them, and those who fight because they love what stands behind them. And which was he? Becky asked, though she already knew the answer. The same as you, Frank replied with quiet certainty. Someone who recognized that true protection sometimes requires both precision violence and healing hands, depending on what the moment demands. As they reached the cemetery gates, Becky's hand unconsciously rose to the brass cartridge still hanging beneath her shirt, the talisman that had guided her actions since receiving it at her grandfather's funeral. Shoot in the space between heartbeats. The inscription had found its ultimate meaning not merely in marksmanship precision, but in the perfect clarity with which she had navigated the moral complexity of confronting her grandfather's killer. Finding the space between tactical necessity and ethical principle, between immediate action and long-term consequence, between personal vengeance and institutional justice. Whatever path she chose moving forward, whether returning to her role as a combat medic or embracing the broader responsibilities her grandfather had anticipated, Rebecca Morgan would carry forward the true essence of the Morgan eye. Not merely exceptional visual processing or unprecedented marksmanship, but the comprehensive analytical capacity to see patterns others missed, to calculate probabilities with mathematical precision, to anticipate decisions before they were implemented. Most importantly, to recognize that the distinction between healer and hunter was artificial when both served the same fundamental purpose, protecting the principles that defined America at its best, even when those principles were threatened from within. The truth had found its new voice, just as her grandfather had promised Raymond Keller decades earlier in Berlin. And that voice would ensure Bloodhawk never again strayed from the principles that justified its creation. The Morgan legacy continued exactly as Harold had intended. Few legacies are passed through blood alone. The most powerful ones travel through our choices, the moments we decide who we truly are, despite what the world demands. Rebecca Morgan began her journey as a healer sworn to save lives, only to discover that her grandfather's greatest gift wasn't the Morgan eye, but the clarity to see when protection requires both compassion and precision. In the space between heartbeats, that perfect stillness her grandfather taught her to find, she discovered a truth older than any intelligence agency or government secret. that sometimes the greatest honor we can pay to those who came before us is not blind loyalty to their words, but faithful stewardship of their principles. The brass cartridge still hangs against her skin, no longer just a relic of the past, but a compass pointing toward her future. Harold Morgan's legacy lives on not in classified files or congressional testimony, but in the unwavering gaze of a woman who learned to see what others miss, the difference between vengeance and justice, between power and purpose. Perhaps we all carry such inheritances within us, the wisdom of those who walked before, waiting for the moment when we're finally ready to become what they always knew we could be.